The winter of 1894 was not a gentle one in St. Petersburg. The frost bit hard against the window panes of the Winter Palace, but the cold inside the gilded halls was something else entirely. It was the chill of a holding pattern. Alexander III, the great bear of a Tsar, was dying. His kidneys were failing. The massive, restless energy that had held the Russian Empire together through sheer force of will was fading, leaving a vacuum that terrified the court, and in the shadow of that dying bear stood his son. Nicholas II, 26 years old, wide-eyed, desperate for guidance he would never receive. The entire fate of the Romanov line, 300 years of blood and iron, was about to land on shoulders that felt painfully narrow. In the midst of this paralyzing fear, there was only one thing Nicholas was certain of. He needed her. He needed Alex. Princess Alex of Hesse. She was a creature of contrast to the Romanov world. Where the Russian court was loud, volatile, obsessed with display and excess, Alex was quiet, inward, deeply serious. She was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. She carried the blood of the British Empire, the world's most powerful democracy. Yet she possessed a soul that yearned for the mystical and the absolute. Nicholas had loved her for years. It was a stubborn, desperate love, the kind that feels inevitable and dangerous. His father had opposed it. The court had opposed it. The religious barrier stood tall. She was Lutheran, Russia was Orthodox. But as Alexander III sank toward his grave, the opposition crumbled. Necessity, or perhaps just the sheer blind will of a young man facing the abyss, took over. The marriage was not just a wedding, it was a geopolitical collision wrapped in white satin. When the diplomatic correspondence from November 1894 spread out on a table, the lines were sharp. The British ambassadors were ecstatic, or as ecstatic as British diplomats allow themselves to be. They saw in this union a bridge. For decades, the great game had been played in the dust of Central Asia, a cold and deadly rivalry between Russian bears and British lions over India and the mountain passes of Afghanistan. London looked at this girl, this shy, awkward German-English princess, and saw an anchor. They believed she would pull the volatile Russian autocracy toward the stable, constitutional moderation of the West. They imagined a future where the Tsar would be a grandson-in-law to Victoria, a partner in the great civilizing mission of the Anglo-Saxon world. The guest lists for the funeral and the wedding that followed read like a who's who of European royalty, a family reunion of cousins who would, in 2 decades, tear each other apart. But in that winter, they smiled. They toasted. They thought the blood ties were strong enough to stop the machinery of war. They were wrong. The Russian court did not see a bridge. They saw a hostage. The Slavophiles, the men who believed Russia had a unique, holy destiny separate from the rotting West, looked at Alex with suspicion. They saw a German, a Protestant, an outsider. They feared she would dilute the pure Russian spirit of the Tsar. They whispered that she was too English, too intellectual, too cold. They did not know that underneath that cold exterior was a fire that would eventually burn the dynasty down, but not in the way they expected. Nicholas did not care about the geopolitics. He did not care about the great game. He opened his diary, and the words are heartbreaking in their simplicity. He wrote of her arrival with a trembling joy. "My dream has come true," he scribbled. The ink on the page is hurried. The writing of a man who is terrified that reality might snatch his happiness away. While his father lay dying in the Livadia Palace in the Crimea, Nicholas was pacing the corridors, not thinking of the empire he was about to inherit, but of the woman who had finally agreed to take the Orthodox name of Alexandra Fyodorovna. The transition was brutal. There was no time to mourn. There was no time to learn. One day, she was a guest. The next, she was the empress of all the Russias. The wedding was rushed. It had to be. The country needed an heir. The dynasty needed legitimacy. The ceremony took place in the middle of the official mourning period, a strange, macabre dance where the guests wore black for the funeral of the father and then quickly changed into uniforms of gold and silver for the marriage of the sun. The smell of incense was thick enough to choke on. The choirs sang, their voices rising to the high vaults of the chapel. But the atmosphere was heavy. It felt less like a celebration and more like a desperate pact signed in blood. This was the moment the isolation began. The historical argument that this union was a political convergence is true, but it misses the darker, more intimate truth. It created a sealed room. By bringing this specific woman into the heart of the Russian autocracy, Nicholas effectively closed the door on the world. Alexandra was not a politician. She was not a diplomat. She was a woman who believed in the divine right of kings with a fanatical intensity that would have made Louis XIV blush. She looked at the British model and saw weakness. She saw a queen, her own grandmother, reduced to a figurehead by parliament and ministers. She loathed it. She had come to Russia not to anglicize it, but to save it from the very liberalism her family represented in the West. She reinforced Nicholas's worst instincts. He was naturally shy, naturally unsure of himself. He wanted nothing more than to retreat to the countryside, to chop wood, to be a simple husband and father. The Russian court, however, required a performance. It required an autocrat who could stand on the balcony of the Winter Palace and command the masses. It required a man who could navigate the treacherous waters of the Duma, the ministers and the generals. Nicholas tried. He put on the uniform. He attended the balls. But he looked for an escape. He found it in her. The correspondence of 1894 and 1895 reveals the shift. The letters from the foreign ministers become frantic. They complain that the new Tsar is inaccessible. He is late to meetings. He is vague. He spends his evenings in the private apartments with his wife. The union of destiny had effectively created a rival power center, the private family. In the past, the Tsarina had been a public fixture, a mother of the nation. Alexandra refused to be the mother of the nation. She wanted to be a wife. She looked at the Russian nobility with a withering disdain. She found them decadent, loose, untrustworthy. She pulled the curtains shut. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. The British hopes for a liberalized Russia died on the honeymoon. Alexandra, far from being a bridge, became a wall. She encouraged Nicholas to distrust his ministers. She told him that he was chosen by God, and that he must answer only to God, not to the bureaucrats in their frock coats. It was a toxic feedback loop. He doubted himself. She told him he was right. He wanted to retreat. She told him the world was against them and they must cling to each other. There is a specific entry in Nicholas's diary from those early months that sticks in the mind. He describes a walk in the garden, just the two of them. The snow was falling. He wrote about the silence. He wrote about how happy he was. It is a lovely image, a young couple in love. But when you look at the date, when you read the newspapers from that same day, you see the headlines. Unrest in the cities, strikes in the factories, the creaking of the vast, unwieldy bureaucracy that needed a firm hand. The Tsar was walking in the snow, holding the hand of his English bride, while the isolation was not just emotional, it was physical. The couple moved out of the Winter Palace, that great, drafty, public museum of a building, and began to spend more and more time at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. It was a family home. It was cozy. It had fake Tudor beams, a tribute to Alexandra's nostalgia for the English countryside. It was a fortress of domesticity, and it was there, behind the locked gates, that the fate of the Romanovs was truly sealed. The diplomats continued to write their letters. They noted the absence of the Tsar. They noted the influence of the Tsarina. They noted the chilling of relations with Berlin and the stiffness with London. They saw the political convergence. They saw the lines on the map. They did not see the couple in the drawing room, sitting in the twilight speaking in English, their private language, shutting out the noise of the ministers waiting in the hall. This was the seed of the ruin. Not a bad treaty, not a lost war, but a marriage. A union that was so complete, so intense, that it left no room for the empire. Nicholas loved Alexandra more than he loved Russia. He trusted her more than he trusted his ministers, and she, scarred by the early deaths of her own family, terrified by the fragility of life, gripped him with a possessive love that suffocated the monarch and birthed a tyrant. The wedding guest list in 1894 was full of kings and princes. None of them could have imagined that the most powerful person in the room was not the Tsar, nor the bride, but the quiet, desperate love they shared. A love that would kill them both. Moscow in May of 1896 was a city holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs and the sharper, metallic tang of preparation. For weeks, the ancient capital had been transforming itself into a stage. Banners hung from every window, bunting draped across the gray stone facades. The city was swollen with people, peasants from the muddy villages, merchants in their best coats, foreign dignitaries in plumed helmets, all of them crammed into the winding streets. They were here for the coronation. They were here to see Nicholas II crowned as the autocrat of all the Russias. It was meant to be the moment the shy, uncertain young man we met in the shadow of his father's death finally stepped into the light. It was meant to be a festival of unity. Instead, it became a funeral before the body was cold. The focal point of the celebration was to be Kodinka Field. It is a name that sits heavy in the mouth now. But then, it was just a wide, flat expanse of land on the outskirts of the city. A military training ground. Hard, packed earth. The plan was simple, grandiose, and characteristically Russian in its disregard for the individual. A festival for the people, a Nawodno Gulianai. Hundreds of thousands of subjects would gather to receive the Tsar's bounty. Food, drink, souvenirs, a way for the new sovereign to physically manifest his love for his people, to bridge the gap between the gilded icons of the cathedral and the dirt of the streets. The logistics were a nightmare. The authorities, in their infinite bureaucratic wisdom, decided to distribute tickets. Roughly 400,000 people were expected. But rumors travel faster than trains in Russia. Rumors that the food was running out. Rumors that the best gifts were going to the first arrivals. Rumors that there was not enough for everyone. The night before the festival, the field was already a sea of humanity. The police reports later would try to shift the blame, but the numbers were stark. They had stationed perhaps 200 policemen and a few squadrons of Cossacks to control a crowd that swelled like a tide. The night was cold. The sky was a deep, bruised purple. People huddled together for warmth. Families sat on the hard ground, wrapping their coats tight. The tension was palpable. You could taste it in the air, a mix of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. They were waiting. Waiting for the dawn. Waiting for the Tsar. At 5 in the morning, the rumors became a roar. Someone shouted. A misunderstanding. A panic. The crowd surged. It wasn't a walk or a run. It was a crush. A human wave was moving toward the wooden booths where the food was stacked. The police were swallowed instantly. The Cossacks on horseback were useless, their mounts rearing up, adding to the terror. And then came the ditches. Kodinka Field was not smooth. It was scarred with trenches, dug for military exercises hidden in the dark. When the front ranks fell, they didn't just stumble. They disappeared. They fell into the pits, and the people behind them, blinded by the dust and the panic, pushed forward. They fell on top, and then more, and more. The sound was not screaming at first. It was the sound of wet earth and snapping wood and a low guttural moan that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The pressure was so immense that people were lifted off their feet. They were crushed against the wooden barricades. Bones shattered. Ribs collapsed. The air was squeezed from the lungs. The dust rose in a choking cloud, mixing with the early morning mist, turning the scene into a gray hell. When the sun finally broke through, it illuminated a horror that defies description. The police reports, written in that clinical, shaky hand, listed the dead at 1,389. The newspapers, like the New York Times, reported the numbers with a stunned detachment. But the numbers lie. They always lie. They hide the specific, grinding reality of the thing. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. They were twisted in shapes that the human body should never take, faces blue and black, pressed into the mud. The most heartbreaking detail, the one that lingers in the back of the throat, is the loot. Clutched in the dead hands of the peasants were the souvenirs: a metal cup, a handkerchief, a gingerbread cookie now crushed into dust. They died for a piece of bread and a cheap tin mug stamped with the imperial double-headed eagle. The field was stripped of its grass, churned into a paste of blood and earth and dropped shoes. Nicholas was told early. He was in his rooms preparing for the day's festivities. The report came in: a disaster, a tragedy. And here is where the foundation of the legend was poured. Nicholas wanted to stop. He wanted to cancel the day. He wanted to go to the field, to see the wounded, to pray for the dead. His instincts, his human heart told him to stop. But he was surrounded. The courtiers, the uncles, the generals, they pulled him aside. They whispered in his ear. "You cannot cancel," they said. "The French ambassador is here. The ball is tonight. The alliance depends on it. The people expect a show. To stop now would be to admit weakness. It would be a bad omen to cancel a celebration." So, the young Tsar, already drowning in the complexity of a job he was never trained for, listened to the wrong voices. He let himself be led. He went to the ball at the French embassy that night. Picture the scene. The crystal chandeliers scatter light across the uniforms, the rustle of silk, the clinking of champagne glasses. The orchestra is playing a waltz. Nicholas was there. Alexandra was there, pale, her eyes red. She would later say she felt like she was walking on graves. They smiled. They bowed. They danced. They drank the health of the alliance. Outside, the widows of Kodinka were still digging through the mud for their husbands. The hospitals were overflowing with the maimed. The morgues were stacked to the ceiling. The disconnect was absolute. It was a fracture in the reality of the monarchy. The New York Times correspondent noted the strange contrast. The foreign press saw it clearly. The Tsar was dancing while his subjects were being buried. The damage was done. It was not just the deaths. Accidents happen. Crowds are dangerous. Russia is a hard place. It was the response. The lack of tears, the perceived indifference. The regime sent money to the families, a few thousand rubles, a pittance. The police chief was promoted. The Minister of the Interior, who had organized the festival, kept his post. It was a slap in the face. A dismissal of the suffering. This was the moment the nickname stuck. Nikolai Krvavi, Nicholas the Bloody. It is a name usually reserved for tyrants who order massacres, for dictators who purge their enemies. Nicholas was not a tyrant in that sense. He was a man who could not say no. He was a man who preferred the smooth surface of etiquette to the jagged edge of reality. But to the peasant in the village, to the worker in the factory, the distinction did not matter. The Tsar was the father, and the father had danced while his children suffocated in a ditch. The superstition took root immediately. The Russian soul is prone to seeing signs, to reading the world as a text of God's will. The death of the first Romanov, Michael, founded the dynasty. The coronation of the last was marked by a mass grave. It felt like a seal, a curse. The people looked at the young couple, standing on the balcony of the palace, and they did not see the divinity of the autocracy. They saw a stain. The cups, those white enamel mugs with the gold rims, became relics of a sort. Not holy relics, but cursed ones. For years afterward, they turned up in the markets of Moscow. Peasants would not drink from them. They were considered bad luck, objects of death. They were a constant, physical reminder of that Tuesday morning. They sat on the shelves of the poor, useless, gathering dust, a symbol of a regime that gave gifts that killed. The trauma of Kodinka did not just tarnish the reputation, it hardened the heart of the Tsarina. Alexandra, already shy, already terrified of the Russian mob, saw the tragedy as a personal attack. She saw the criticism in the newspapers as betrayal. She retreated further into her shell. She decided that the outside world was cruel, that the court was hostile, that only she and Nicholas mattered. The circle tightened. The isolation we saw beginning at the wedding became a fortress. They turned away from the public gaze, believing that the public only wanted to tear them down, and in doing so, they ensured that the public would eventually try. Nicholas carried the guilt. He wrote about it in his diary, his small, neat handwriting hiding the massive weight of the error. But he did not change. He continued to trust the men who told him to go to the ball. He continued to value the appearance of order over the mess of truth. He learned the wrong lesson. He learned it to hide. The field eventually dried out. The grass grew back over the trenches. The bodies were buried in the cemeteries, unmarked. Rows of cheap wooden crosses, the memory of the sound, that terrible lowing of the crowd, faded from the ears of the city. But the name remained, Nicholas the Bloody. It was a brand, and as the years went by, as the strikes came and the wars came and the hunger came, the people would remember the morning of the coronation. They would remember the champagne toasts and the crushed bodies. They would remember that their reign began with a ditch full of people clutching cheap tin cups. It was the first crack in the dam, and through it the dark water began to seep, slow and cold and unstoppable. The blood did not behave as it should. It is a simple biological fact, a failure of a single protein. But for the Romanovs, it was a sentence handed down by a vengeful god. For generations, the House of Hanover had woven its DNA through the royal houses of Europe, carrying with it a dark, invisible thread. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, was a carrier. Her daughter Alice was a carrier. And Alex, the Tsarina of all the Russias, carried the curse in her very veins. When the long-awaited heir, Alexei Nikolaevich, was born in the summer of 1904, the bells rang out across the empire with a force that seemed to shake the sky. The dynasty was saved. The succession was secure. But in the quiet of the nursery, the doctors looked at the infant's navel and saw a stain that would not fade. They saw the blood welling up, dark and ominous, refusing to clot. It is hard to overstate the terror of that moment for a mother. Alexandra knew what this meant. She had seen it before. She had watched her own brother Friedrich bleed to death as a child after a fall. She had seen the suffering of her uncle Leopold. She knew that her precious son, the hope of the Holy Russian Empire, was living on the edge of a blade. One wrong move, one stumble, a simple bruise, and the life would drain out of him. The diagnosis was a death warrant written in invisible ink, signed the moment he was conceived. The medical dispatches from the court physicians, men like Dr. Doe, Eugene Botkin, and the specialists called in from Moscow and even abroad, tell a story of helpless observation. Hemophilia was a phantom. It could not be cured. It could barely be treated. The medical journals of the time offered nothing but sympathy and bed rest. And so the Tsarina turned her back on the white coats and the sterile instruments. She turned toward the icons. She turned toward the ancient, desperate hope of a miracle. The letters she wrote to her sister Victoria, the Princess Louis of Battenberg, are difficult to read. They're frantic, breathless documents. She writes of her fear. She writes of the sweet, unfortunate baby. She writes of the nights spent sitting by the crib, watching the rise and fall, a small chest, terrified that the next breath might be the last. "My heart is heavy," she scrawled, the ink blurring where tears might have fallen. "Our poor little boy suffers so." She was a woman, consumed. The political argument here is not one of ideology, but of biology. The health of the heir became the central nervous system of the government. Every decision, every movement of the court, was filtered through the prism of Alexei's fragility. The physical reality of the disease was grotesque. It was not just the external bleeding, it was the internal hemorrhages that were the true torture. A bump on the knee could cause the joint to fill with blood. The pressure would build, hot and throbbing, stretching the skin until it shone. The pain was excruciating. A child screaming for hours, his legs swollen and black, unable to move, unable to find a position that offered even a moment of relief. and the doctors stood by holding the hand of a mother who was watching her son being eaten alive from the inside. This was the secret that rotted the core of the autocracy. The public did not know, the officials did not know, the Duma did not know. The official line was that the Tsarevich was delicate. He was often ill. That was all. The truth was a state secret of the highest order. To admit that the heir to the throne was incurably ill, that the little father of the future was physically broken, would have shattered the mystique of the Romanov invincibility. It would have been a sign of weakness that the enemies of the state, the revolutionaries, the foreign powers, would have exploited without mercy. So the Tsar and Tsarina built a wall around their son. They isolated him. They isolated them. They isolated themselves. The political trajectory of the entire empire began to warp under the weight of this secret. Nicholas, the father, was torn in two. He had to be the Tsar, the autocrat, the man who held the reins of a vast, chaotic nation. But he also had to be the protector of a child who could die from a stumble in the hallway. The strain on his face in the photographs from those years is visible. He looks older. His eyes are tired. He began to withdraw. The important business of the state was delayed. Ministers waited in antechambers while the Tsar sat by the bedside of his suffering son. The machinery of government slowed, grinding against the gears of a family tragedy. Alexandra, however, was transformed. The shy, reticent girl from Darmstadt hardened into a fanatic. She believed that God was testing her. She believed that her suffering was a form of penance. Her religious fervor, always present, curdled into something desperate and obsessive. She stopped trusting the court. She stopped trusting the family. She felt the walls closing in. She needed a savior. She needed someone who could do what the doctors could not. And that is where the door swung open. The search for a cure in Russia was not just a medical pursuit. It was a spiritual marketplace. The empire was awash with holy men, mystics, and wonder-workers. It was a culture that venerated suffering, that believed in the power of the saintly to intercede with God. When science failed, faith was the only currency left. Alexandra began to listen to the whispers. She began to accept the prayers of the starets, the wandering pilgrims who claimed to have a direct line to the divine. The primary sources show the shift. The letters to her sister changed tone. The despair is still there, but there is a new, frantic hope. She writes of prayers. She writes of signs. She clutched at straws, and in the Russian religious landscape, straws often looked like dirty, illiterate peasants who could quote scripture and see into the soul. The desperation for Alexei's life made her susceptible to the one thing the Romanov court had always managed to keep at arm's length: the unchecked influence of the irrational. The Tsarevich's illness created a vacuum of power. A healthy heir means a stable succession. A sick heir means instability. It means fear. It means that the people closest to the source of the pain the mother wields an influence that is terrifying in its intensity. Alexandra began to exert pressure on Nicholas. She told him what to do. She told him who to trust. She was the guardian of the heir, and in her mind that gave her the right to rule through him. She saw conspiracies everywhere. She saw the bad men who wanted to hurt her baby, not just physically but politically. The liberal ministers, the Duma, they were all threats to the sacred autocracy that she was trying to preserve for her son. The environment in the Alexander Palace grew toxic. The smell of camphor and stale incense hung in the air. The guards at the door were doubled. The doctors walked on eggshells, fearful of the Tsarina's wrath if they admitted defeat. Dr. Time, Bakin, in his private notes, expresses a profound sadness, not just for the boy, but for the situation. He saw the political damage being done. He saw the Tsarina's growing reliance on holy men who promised what he could not deliver. He was a man of science watching his world be swallowed by superstition. And the bleeding continued. There was the incident at Spala in 1912, a crisis so severe that the Tsarina was confined to her bed weeping, while the Tsar sat staring into space. The business of the empire completely forgotten. Telegrams were sent out. Prayers were offered in every church. The death of the heir seemed certain. The court was in panic. The stock market in St. Petersburg crashed. The instability was real, visceral. It was caused by a single boy's bruised thigh. The world held its breath. It was in this atmosphere of near death and miraculous recovery that the most dangerous element entered the equation. A recovery, when it happened, was never attributed to the doctors. It was attributed to prayer. It was attributed to the holy men who had been praying for the child. This reinforced the Tsarina's belief that the answers lay not in the rational world, but in the mystical one. It validated the presence of those who claimed to possess the power of God. The biological shadow cast by Alexei's hemophilia was long and dark. It fell across the political landscape, obscuring the light of reason. It forced the Tsarina to look for help in the shadows. It made the Tsar passive. It turned the court into a hospital ward, where the rules of hygiene were dictated by a mother's terror. The political trajectory of Russia was no longer determined. Look for help in the shadows. It made the Tsar passive. It turned the court into a hospital ward, where the rules of hygiene were dictated by a mother's terror. The political trajectory of Russia was no longer determined by treaties or laws. It was determined by the viscosity of a child's blood. The desperate need to save the body of the heir would ultimately destroy the body of the state. And in the quiet of the nursery, surrounded by medicine bottles and icons, the fate of 300 million people rested in the fragile hands of a boy who just wanted the pain to stop. He walked into the palace smelling of the road. That is the first thing the footman noticed. Not the scent of incense or the heavy perfumes the aristocrats sprayed on their throats, but the raw, earthy smell of the village. Manure, turnips, unwashed wool. Grigory Rasputin, a name that would become a synonym for evil, for the corruption of a dynasty. But when he first stood in the corridors of the Winter Palace, he was just a man. A starets, a holy wanderer from the frozen depths of Siberia. He had teeth that were yellow and broken. His hair was greasy, falling in unkempt strands over a forehead weathered by wind and prayer. He did not look like a kingmaker. He looked like a beggar who had wandered in from the cold. Yet he possessed something the Grand Dukes and the generals in their gilded uniforms did not. He had the ear of the Empress. The surveillance transcripts from the secret police, the Okhrana, paint a picture of a man who was constantly watched, yet completely free. They noted his arrival times. They noted the women who followed him. They noted the bottles of wine consumed in the back rooms of restaurants, but they could not record the specific vibration of his voice in the private chambers of the Tsarina. That was a space where the police reports could not go. Alexandra was a woman living in a fortress of her own making. By the time the war broke out in 1914, the isolation we saw at the wedding had calcified into something harder, almost impenetrable. She was hated by the court. She was mocked by the society pages. She was seen as a German spy, a cold Protestant, a woman who did not understand the Russian soul. She was terribly, painfully lonely. Nicholas was kind, but he was weak. He could not protect her from the whispers. He could not stop the bleeding of their son. Rasputin did not offer her politics. He offered her calm. When he knelt beside Alexei's bed during a hemorrhage, he did not fumble with medical instruments. He did not offer sterile, hopeless pronouncements. He prayed. He spoke to the boy in a low, rhythmic murmur. He told stories. And somehow the bleeding stopped, whether it was hypnosis or coincidence or the strange, feverish faith that the Empress placed in him. It worked. To Alexandra, this was not medicine. It was a miracle. It was proof that God had sent this dirty, crude man to save the holy Russia she loved so desperately. Her letters to him survive. They are not the writings of a statesman to an advisor. They are the writings of a drowning woman to a life raft. She called him our friend. She wrote, "I need your wisdom." She wrote, "I am lost without you." The vocabulary is intimate, bordering on the obsessive. She was not sleeping. She was anxious. Her heart was racing. Rasputin was the only one who could quiet the noise in her head. Then came the Great War. The guns began to roar in the east. Nicholas, in a moment of fatal pride, decided to take personal command of the army. He left St. Petersburg. He left the capital. He went to the front, to the town of Mogilev, hundreds of miles away. He left his wife behind to rule the empire. This is where the vacuum opened up, a black hole in the center of the Russian government. With Nicholas gone, the daily business of running the country fell to the Tsarina. She was the regent in all but name, but she had no political training. She had no allies. She was terrified. She sat at her desk in the Alexander Palace, surrounded by papers she did not understand, paralyzed by the weight of decisions that could kill thousands of men. She needed to hear a sure voice, a voice that spoke with the authority of God. She turned to Rasputin. The letters began to fly back and forth. From the front, Nicholas wrote to his wife about the movements of troops in the supply lines. Alexandra wrote back, but she added her own counsel, the counsel of our friend. Rasputin did not understand logistics. He did not understand artillery or railway timetables. He understood the Tsarina's fear. He told her what she wanted to hear. He told her to stand firm. He told her that the liberals, the Duma, the ministers who argued for reform were the enemies of the Tsar. They were the devils trying to tear the family apart. The police surveillance logs from this period show Rasputin visiting the palace at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. The courtiers would see him slip past the sentries, his boots tracking mud on the carpets. They seethed with impotent rage, but they could do nothing. To attack Rasputin was to attack the Tsarina, and to attack the Tsarina was to attack the Tsar. The power dynamic was subtle, insidious. Rasputin did not issue decrees. He did not sit in the ministries. He sat in the kitchen of the palace drinking tea with Alexandra, or in his own apartment, receiving petitions from people who wanted jobs. He became the gatekeeper. If you wanted to be a minister, if you wanted a contract to supply boots to the army, if you wanted a promotion, you went to Rasputin. You kissed his hand. You brought him gifts, icons, vodka, money, and he would write a note. "Little mother," he would say in his scratchy handwriting, misspelling words. "This man is good. Help him." And Alexandra, desperate for stability, convinced that Rasputin saw the truth that the worldly men could not see, would sign the paper. The result was chaos. The government began to spin like a top. Ministers were fired and hired at random. One day, a man was in charge of the interior. Next, he was gone, replaced by a non-entity who happened to please the holy man. The ministerial leapfrog, they called it. The bureaucracy lost all coherence. The railway system, already strained by the war, began to buckle because the men in charge were incompetent sycophants. The food supply to the cities faltered. The queues for bread grew longer. The people standing in the cold, their stomachs empty, began to whisper about the dark presence in the palace. They did not blame Nicholas. Not yet. They blamed the German woman and her lover, the satanic monk. The transcripts from the Yusupov palace, recorded years later during the plot to kill him, capture the mood of the aristocracy. Prince Felix Yusupov, rich, elegant, and deeply disturbed by the ruin of his country, invited Rasputin to his home. The basement was prepared. Wine, cakes laced with cyanide, but the focus here is not on one death. It is the reason for the death. Yusupov and his co-conspirators were not just killing a man. They were trying to sever a nerve, the nerve connecting the empress to her source of comfort. They saw him as a demon, a holy devil. A man who used religion as a mask for debauchery. And to be fair, Rasputin did not live like a saint. The police reports detail his nights in the restaurants of the capital. He drank until he passed out. He surrounded himself with women of loose morals, telling them that to be saved one must first sin. He was a bundle of contradictions, a mystic who read the Bible and wept, and a drunkard who exposed himself in public. It was this duality that broke the mind of the court. They could not understand how the empress could not see it. They thought she was bewitched. But she was not bewitched. She was exhausted. She was a mother watching her son die and her husband fail. Rasputin was the only one who told her that everything would be all right. He validated her belief that she was right, that the autocracy was divine, that the people loved the Tsar despite the bread lines and the body counts. He filled the silence in her life with a loud, confident voice. The surveillance transcripts from the night of his murder are chilling. They record the sound of a gramophone playing Yankee Doodle Dandy over and over again, a strange, looping soundtrack to the assassination. They record the cars arriving. The shots were fired, but they cannot record the feeling of the empire collapsing. When Rasputin's body was pulled from the icy Neva River, the Tsarina wept. She felt the wall crumbling. Without our friend, who would protect Alexei? Who would tell her that God was still listening? The death of the peasant did not save the monarchy. It only still listening. The death of the peasant did not save the monarchy. It only made the isolation complete. The aristocracy had struck at the empress's heart. The trust between the throne and the nobility was gone. The bond between the Tsarina and the people was already broken, shattered by the rumors of the holy devil ruling from the shadows. The government was a hollow shell, eaten out from the inside by a single desperate need for emotional support. The vacuum had been filled, but with poison. And now, with the monk dead, the vacuum returned, wider and darker than before, just weeks before the waves of history would come crashing through the gates of the Winter Palace to wash them all away. The winter of 1905 had a bite to it that felt personal. St. Petersburg does not just get cold, it becomes a deep freeze, a tomb of ice where the Neva River turns into a solid white scar cutting through the city. The air was thick with coal smoke and frost. It settled in the lungs. It turned the faces of the workers gray. In the sprawling industrial districts, the factories were clanking, great iron bellows of production. But the men and women inside them were starving. Wages had dropped. The price of bread had risen. The managers, distant and cruel, cared little for the fingers that were crushed in the gears. A strange mood was moving through the tenements. It was not a mood of revolution, not yet. It was a mood of desperate, childlike faith. Father George Gaffon was the vessel for this mood. He was a priest, a man of the church, but he looked more like a laborer. Broad shoulders, a thick beard, a voice that could carry across a square. He had founded the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers, a union sanctioned by the government, meant to keep the peace. But the peace had broken. Gaffon had walked the slums. He had seen the children with swollen bellies. He had seen the men coughing up black dust. He drafted a petition. It was not a demand for the Tsar's head. It was a plea. A long, winding document written on thick paper, covered in thousands of signatures. It asked for an 8-hour workday. It asked for a constituent assembly. It asked for an end to the war with Japan that was bleeding the country dry. But mostly it asked for the Tsar to come out and see his people. The theology of the Little Father was absolute in the Russian mind. The Tsar was chosen by God. The Tsar loved his people like a father loves his children. If the children were suffering, it was because the evil boyars, the greedy ministers and nobles, were hiding the truth from him. If they could just get close enough to the Winter Palace, if they could just show him the petition, he would weep. He would embrace them. He would fix everything. It was a beautiful, naive hope, and it was about to hit a wall of lead. January 22nd, a Sunday. The city woke up under a white shroud. The snow had fallen all night, muffling the sounds of the city, but early in the morning the silence broke. From the outskirts, columns of people began to form. They were not carrying weapons. They were carrying icons, gold-framed paintings of Christ and the Virgin Mary. They carried the tricolor flag of Russia. God save the Tsar. The sound drifted through the streets, a strange, haunting chorus rising from the cold. The Shidlovsky Commission report would later try to piece together the chaos, but the official language could never capture the texture of that morning. There were hundreds of thousands of them, a river of wool and fur moving toward the center of power. They felt safe. They were going to see their father. The police did not stop them. The Cossacks watched from horseback, their breath pluming in the air, their faces blank. Father Gapin was at the head of one column. He was trembling. He had sent a letter to the Tsar the night before, asking for the troops to be withdrawn, asking for a meeting. He received no answer. He pressed on. The crowd behind him pressed on. They were squeezed into the narrow streets leading to the Narva gate. The crush of bodies was intense. The smell of unwashed clothes and cheap vodka mixed with the scent of incense from the icons. It was suffocating. At the Narva gate, the road was blocked. A line of infantry stood shoulder to shoulder. A line of dragoons on horseback stood behind them. They did not look like brothers. They looked like statues of war. The crowd slowed but did not stop. Gapin raised his cross. He shouted that they came in peace. He shouted that the Tsar would protect them. The officer in command raised his sword. He gave the order not to fire warning shots, not to use the butts of their rifles. He gave the order to fire. The sound was deafening, a rolling crash of thunder. The front ranks of the procession simply disintegrated. The icons fell. The flags fell. The bodies fell. The snow, which had been pristine white moments before, turned a shocking, bright crimson. The bullets tore through the heavy winter coats. They shattered bone. The screaming started. It was a high, keen sound that cut through the smoke. It was a slaughter. A mechanical, efficient slaughter. At the Trinity Bridge, another column met the same fate. Machine guns rattled. The sound was like tearing canvas. People threw themselves onto the ice of the frozen Neva, trying to crawl away. The ice cracked. Some drowned in the black water, their heavy coats dragging them down. Others were shot in the back as they ran. The streets of St. Petersburg, the jewel of the empire, became an abattoir. The official count listed 96 dead. The police reports tried to minimize the damage, but the reality on the ground was far worse. Hospitals overflowed. The morgues were full. The dead were stacked in piles in the courtyards of the police stations. The exact number of dead will never be known. It was over 1,000, maybe more. But the numbers are just numbers. The image that mattered was the snow, the red snow. And where was the Tsar? Nicholas II was not at the Winter Palace. He was not hiding under a bed. He was at Tsarskoye Selo, miles away. He had left the city the day before. He had retreated to the safety of his family, to the quiet of his study. When the first reports reached him, he wrote in his diary. He called it a painful day. He wrote about the guilty crowd. He did not see the blood. He did not hear the screams. He read the dry, filtered reports of his ministers. He was told that a violent mob had tried to storm the palace and the troops had done their duty. He believed them. He always believed them. The disconnect was absolute. The people had brought their pain to his doorstep, and he had answered them with bullets from a mile away. Father Gapin survived. He stood amidst the carnage, his white vestments stained with the blood of his followers. The look in his eyes changed. The faith vanished. He looked at the icons lying in the mud, the faces of the saints cracked by hooves. He shouted into the air a curse that echoed across the empire. There is no God any longer. There is no Tsar. The little father was dead. The myth that had held the Russian autocracy together for 3 centuries, the sacred bond between the peasant and the sovereign, was snapped in a single violent afternoon. The people did not see a protector anymore. They saw a butcher. They saw a man who sat in a golden room while his children were ground into the dirt. The Shidlovsky Commission was established to investigate. It was a farce. The workers refused to participate. They saw the commission for what it was, an attempt by the state to wash the blood off its hands with ink and paper. The transcripts of the interviews are a litany of grief. A woman describing her husband, who was shot while holding a picture of the Tsar. A boy with a bullet in his leg, asking why the soldiers shot at the flag. The bureaucracy could not contain the raw, hot anger that was now bubbling up from the streets. The shooting did not quell the unrest. It ignited it. Strikes spread like wildfire. The railways stopped. The telegraph lines were cut. The nobility packed their bags and fled to the countryside, terrified of the rage they sensed building in the dark corners of the city. The Tsar was forced to issue the October Manifesto later that year, promising rights and a parliament. But it was too late. A promise given at gunpoint is not a gift. Throne. They wanted to save it. They wanted to purify it. They went to the palace expecting a miracle. They received a massacre. And in the quiet of the Winter Palace, in the empty halls where the people had hoped to stand, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a grave. The bond of love had been replaced by a bond of hate. The Tsar was no longer the father. He was the enemy. And in the cold, dark winter of 1905, the Russian people began to count the days until they could make him pay. A cumbersome beast, painted dark green with gold trim, smelling of coal smoke and expensive cigars. Inside, the velvet curtains were drawn tight against the August night. In the dim light of the sitting car, Nicholas Romanov sat alone. The year was 1915. The war, the one that was supposed to be a short, sharp victory, had turned into a nightmare. To the south, the great fortresses of Russia were falling like rotten fruit. The German army was pushing through Poland, and the Russian lines were crumbling, dissolving into chaos. The telegrams were piled on his desk, thin strips of paper spitting out dots and dashes of disaster. Nicholas read them with the same blank expression he wore for everything. His diaries from this period are maddening documents. In the margins, between notes about the weather and what he had for tea, he wrote short, dry sentences about the collapse of his army, a difficult day. Sad news from the front. It was as if he were watching a house burn down from a distance, commenting only on the color of the flames. But the distance was about to close. On September 5th, the Tsar made a decision that would seal the fate of his family and his country. He decided to go to the front, not just to visit, not just to inspect. He decided to take supreme command. He would dismiss his uncle, the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, a giant of a man with a booming voice who at least looked like a soldier. Nicholas would take the title of Supreme Commander-in-Chief himself. He would place his own shoulders under the weight of the entire war. It was a decision born of desperation and a strange, naive pride. He thought his presence would inspire the troops. He thought that as the Little Father, his holy aura would stop the German shells. He thought he could fix the broken supply lines and the incompetent generals by simply being there. He did not understand that by taking the wheel of a sinking ship, he was ensuring that when it went under, he would be the captain standing on the bridge. The Stavka, the military headquarters, was located in Mogilev. It was a dusty provincial town hundreds of miles from the capital. When Nicholas arrived, he stepped off the train into a world that had no use for a constitutional monarch. It was a world of maps and logistics, of mud and blood. He took up residence in a modest house near the railway station. He set up his office. He pinned the great map of the Eastern Front to the wall. And then he waited for the war to be won. But the war did not listen to him. The diaries reveal the terrifying banality of his new life. He would wake up early. He would drink his morning coffee. He would receive reports from generals who looked at him with tired, pitying eyes. He would read the casualty lists. Thousands of men. Tens of thousands. And then he would write in his diary, walked in the garden before lunch. The weather is fine. Played dominoes in the evening. It is a dissonance that hurts the head. How could a man write about the weather while his army was being shredded? But that was Nicholas. He retreated into the small details of life to escape the enormous horror of his job. He was a clerk in a palace, filing away the death notices of a generation. The problem was not just that he was a bad general. He knew nothing of strategy. He couldn't read a map to save his life. The problem was that he had made the war personal. Before 1915, when a Russian soldier died in a trench, he died for Russia. He died for the Tsar, yes, but the Tsar was a distant icon, a golden head on a coin. The Tsar was safe in his palace, untouched by the lice and the gas. Now the Tsar was the one giving the orders. When the retreat continued, when the supplies failed to arrive, when the men were sent into machine gun fire without ammunition, the blame could no longer be shifted to a minister or a general. The Tsar had taken command. The Tsar was in charge. Therefore, the Tsar was losing the war. The soldiers in the trenches began to change their tune. The letters home, intercepted by the censors, tell the story. They stopped writing about the little father. They started writing about the bloody Tsar. They looked at their rifles, rusted and useless. They looked at their boots, falling apart in the mud. They looked at their friends, freezing in the cruel winter of the Carpathians. And they knew who to hate. The distance between the Stavka and the front lines was measured in miles, but the distance in experience was measured in centuries. Nicholas lived in a bubble. He rode his horse. He reviewed the troops. He saw the soldiers standing in their ragged lines, cheering him because they had to. He saw what he wanted to see. He saw an army that was struggling but brave. He did not see the rot underneath. He did not see the mutiny in their eyes. And while he was playing commander, the capital was rotting. By leaving St. Petersburg, Nicholas had left the seat of power empty. He had left the Tsarina behind. And as we have seen, the Tsarina was under the spell of a power she could not control. The telegrams between Mogilev and Tsarskoye Selo flew back and forth every day. They were filled with endearments. My own beloved Nicky, my sonny. But they were also filled with politics. Alexandra, isolated and desperate, pushed him to be harsher, to crush the opposition, to stop the Duma from meddling. She told him to stand firm, and he, desperate for any voice that told him he was right, listened. He became harder, colder. The defeats piled up, and his resolve became brittle. He fired competent men and replaced them with fools, just to assert his authority. The railway system, the lifeline of the army, collapsed because it could not manage it. Food sat rotting in boxcars while the cities starved. He looked at the maps, pushing little pins forward, while the real soldiers were eating their horses to stay alive. The winter of 1916 was the breaking point. The diaries from that time are almost monosyllabic. He was tired. He was spiritually drained. He wrote about the heavy snow. He wrote about the silence in the house. The telegrams from the front were screams for help. We have no shells. The men are deserting. The Germans are breaking through. And Nicholas would pick up his pen and write, God is with us. He had trapped himself. If he left the army now, it would be an admission of defeat. It would be a sign that the Tsar had failed. So he stayed. He stayed in the cold house in Mogilev, shuffling papers, signing death warrants, and losing the war. He had turned the autocracy into a military dictatorship, but he was a dictator who couldn't give an order that made sense. The soldiers in the trenches knew. They felt it in their bones. The mystique of the monarchy was gone, stripped away by the wind and the rain. They did not see a holy ruler. They saw a man who had taken them into a slaughterhouse and then sat down to tea. The bond that had survived Kodinka, that had survived Bloody Sunday, finally snapped. They saw a man who had taken them into a slaughterhouse and then sat down to tea. The bond that had survived Kodinka, that had survived Bloody Sunday, finally snapped in the mud of the Great War. The last entry in his war diary before the revolution is chilling in its simplicity. He noted the weather. He noted his walk. He did not note the fact that the world was ending. He did not see the angry crowds gathering in Petrograd. He did not see the soldiers turning their guns around. He sat in his train car, surrounded by maps that meant nothing, holding a pen that could no longer sign away the truth. He had taken the command to save the throne. Instead, he had put a loaded gun to its head. The imperial train was stopped. It sat on the siding near Puskov, a dark, heavy lump of steel in the winter night. The steam engine hissed, a low, tired sound venting into the freezing air. Inside the cars, the silence was thick. It was March 15, 1917. The world outside was catching fire. In Petrograd, the mobs were smashing bakeries. Soldiers were murdering their officers. The regime was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. But here in the Tsar's private salon car, the air was still. The clocks ticked. The lamps burned low. Nicholas Romanov sat at a small writing table. He was not a man given to grand gestures of despair. He was a man of routine, a man who liked his tea hot and his days ordered. But the order had broken. The wires coming into the train were no longer reports. They were demands. General Alexeyev, the chief of staff, the man Nicholas had left in charge of the armies, had sent a telegram. It was not a request for instructions. It was a diagnosis. The disease was fatal. The only cure was the removal of the patient. The betrayal was absolute. It was not the revolutionaries who forced the hand. It was the men in gold braid, the generals, the cousins, the elite who had dined at his table and sworn oaths on the Bible to defend the throne. They looked at the chaos in the capital, the striking workers, the mutinous garrisons, and they did what elites always do when the wind shifts. They calculated the odds. They decided that the monarchy could survive, but the monarch could not. To save the structure, they had to cut out the cornerstone. General Ruzsky, the commander of the Northern Front, entered the car. He looked tired. He looked grim. He did not bow low. The formalities were dissolving. He held a sheaf of telegrams. He laid them out on the green felt of the table. They were from the other commanders, from the Grand Dukes, from the admirals. The message was unanimous. A stampede of paper, abdicate, for the good of the country, to save the army. Nicholas read them. His face was a mask. He did not rage. He did not weep. He simply deflated. The resistance, the stubborn belief in his divine right, evaporated. He looked at the signatures of the men he had trusted, the men who had urged him to take command, who had assured him of victory. Now they were pushing him toward the exit. He picked up his pencil. It was a simple violet pencil, the kind a clerk might use to mark a ledger. The act of abdication was written on a piece of stationery from the Stavka. The handwriting was neat, small, and surprisingly calm. The text was short. He, Nicholas II, renounced the throne. He handed it to his brother, the Grand Duke Michael. He did it to save the army. He did it to stop the civil war. He did it because he was told there was no other choice. He did it because he was tired. The betrayal was not just in the act itself, but in the lie that surrounded it. The generals told him that his abdication would calm the streets. They told him that the Duma would form a new government and the war would go on. They were buying stability with his blood. They thought they could perform a surgery, removing the Tsar and leaving the institution intact. They did not understand that the Tsar was the institution. Without him, there was no glue. There was only a vacuum. When he signed the paper, the sound was a scratch, a tiny noise in the quiet room. But it was the sound of 300 years of Romanov history ending. It was the sound of a wall falling. He stood up. He went to his adjutant and asked for a glass of beer. A strange, mundane detail. The former Tsar of all the Russias, stripped of his title in a train car in the forest, was drinking a glass of beer. He was no longer the autocrat. He was just a man named Nicholas, a man who had failed at the one job he was born to do. The logs of General Alexeyev tell the real story. They show the frantic coordination. They showed the relief in the headquarters when the word came back. The generals congratulated themselves. They thought they had pulled the ripcord. They thought they had saved the plane. They did not know that the plane had already lost its wings. They had traded a sacred king for a provisional government that would last only 8 months. The train started moving again. It rolled toward Mogilev to the headquarters, so Nicholas could say goodbye to the army that had betrayed him. The soldiers on the platform there did not cheer. They stood in a sullen silence. Some of them ripped the epaulets from their own shoulders. The bond was snapped. The oath was null. Some of them ripped the epaulets from their own shoulders. The bond was snapped. The oath was null. The generals had won their argument, and in doing so, they had lost the war. They had sacrificed the shepherd to the wolves, thinking the wolves would then go home. But the wolves were just getting hungry. Nicholas sat by the window, watching the gray landscape slide past. The snow was dirty. The trees were black skeletons against the sky. He had done what they asked. He had given them what they wanted. He had taken the blame. He was no longer the bloody Nicholas of the revolutionaries. He was a victim of history, and a victim of his friends. The pencil was put away. The paper was folded. The signature was dry. The rain was over. And the long walk to the basement in Ekaterinburg had begun. The train crept back into the station at Tsarskoye Selo. It moved slowly, hesitant, like an animal that knows it is returning to a cage. It was late March 1917. The snow was melting, turning the roads into rivers of thick, gray mud. Nicholas stepped off the train. He was no longer the emperor of all the Russias. He was Colonel Romanov, a private citizen. The guards at the gate did not salute him. They checked his papers. They looked at his face with a mix of curiosity and smug satisfaction. The master had become the prisoner. The Alexandra Palace was waiting. It sat low and white in the damp spring air, a building of perfect neoclassical symmetry. It had been their refuge, their private world. Now it was a trap. The gates slammed shut behind the car. The sentries were posted. The perimeter was drawn. Inside, the family was waiting. Alexandra, the 4 girls, and the sickly boy. They were all there, huddled in the familiar rooms, surrounded by the furniture they had bought, the portraits they had hung, the silence they had cultivated. The first few weeks were a blur of the absurd. The provisional government, that clumsy body of lawyers and idealists trying to run a collapsing empire, did not know what to do with them, so they did nothing. They locked the doors. They posted a guard. And they waited. The diaries of the former empress open a window into a mind that refuses to break. Her entries are short, precise, almost aggressively mundane. She writes about the weather. She writes about the food. She writes about the health of the children. "Morning gray," she scribbled. "Coffee in the library. Alexei is happy. There is no wailing. There is no gnashing of teeth. There is only a desperate, fierce clinging to the ordinary." This was the psychological defense, the routine. The iron schedule that had ruled their lives for 20 years did not vanish because the crown was gone. In fact, it became more important. It became a shield. If they could just wake up at the same time, drink tea from the same cups, pray at the same icons, then the world outside could not touch them. The revolution was noise. The routine was sanity. Nicholas threw himself into physical work. It was the only language he understood. He put on his heavy boots and went into the park. There was snow to be shoveled, paths to be cleared. He chopped wood. He hauled branches. He worked until his back ached and his hands were blistered. The soldiers guarding the perimeter watched him. They smoked cigarettes and laughed. Here was the man who had commanded armies, now reduced to hauling firewood like a peasant. But Nicholas did not mind the laughter. He needed the rhythm of the axe, the thud of metal into wood. It was real. It was something he could control. The government in Petrograd was a mess. The army was dissolving. The wood was solid. The wood stayed down when you cut it. The guard rosters from this period tell a story of a siege in slow motion. Initially, the guards were men from the imperial regiments, men who had once sworn to die for the Tsar. They were polite. They called him Your Majesty behind the backs of the officers. They smuggled in letters. They looked the other way when the family walked into the garden. It was a gentleman's imprisonment, a house arrest for the upper crust. But the atmosphere began to curdle. The provisional government replaced the gentle guards with rougher men, factory workers, militiamen, men with rough hands and hard eyes who saw the Romanovs not as people, but as symbols of everything they hated. The rosters list the changes. New names, new regiments. The soldiers began to drink. They became aggressive. They would stand outside the windows and shout obscenities at the Grand Duchesses. They would deliberately stomp their muddy boots on the clean floors of the palace. The family retreated further. They closed the heavy curtains. They moved their lives into the inner rooms, away from the windows. The gilded cage became smaller. The air in the palace grew stale. It smelled of medicine, boiled cabbage, and unwashed bodies. The plumbing began to fail. The radiators clanked and groaned. The grandeur of the Alexander Palace, the silk wall coverings, and the polished parquet floor began to look shabby. Dust gathered in the corners. The paint peeled. Yet they kept the schedule: breakfast at 9, lessons for the children, lunch, walks in the afternoon if the guards allowed it, dinner, readings aloud in the evening. Nicholas would read to the family from the classics, Thackeray, Tolstoy. His voice was calm, a low monotone that filled the room. He read about fictional lives, fictional problems, ignoring the fact that their own story was hurtling toward a cliff. Alexandra spent her time knitting. She sat in a high-backed chair, her needles clicking, a steady metallic rhythm like a ticking clock. She knitted socks and scarves for the soldiers. Even now, with the soldiers outside shouting for her blood, she knit for them. It was a ritual, a way to be useful, a way to be the mother of the nation that the nation no longer wanted. Her diary entries from those months are heartbreaking in their brevity. She notes her son. She notes the rudeness of a guard. She notes the color of the sunset. But she never writes about the fear. She never writes about the future. The surreal normalcy was a collective hallucination. They all agreed to pretend that this was just a summer holiday gone wrong, that the angry men outside were just uninvited guests, that the locked gates were just a temporary inconvenience. They ignored the fact that they could not send a letter without it being read. They ignored the fact that their friends had abandoned them. They ignored the fact that the Tsar's cousin, the King of England, had refused to take them in. That rejection stung the hardest. It was the final confirmation that the world had turned its back on them. The gardens became their only escape. In the early summer of 1917, the park was a riot of green. The lilacs bloomed, the chestnut trees flowered. The air was thick with the scent of pollen and damp earth. They would walk in a tight group. Nicholas in front, Alexandra leaning on his arm, the children trailing behind. They looked like ghosts of the past haunting the grounds. The guards would follow them, keeping a respectful distance or a disrespectful distance, depending on the man. Sometimes they would find a quiet bench and sit. They would watch the swallows dip and dive over the ponds. For a moment, looking at them from a distance, you could forget who they were. You could forget the war. You could forget the revolution. You could just see a family enjoying the sun. But then, a soldier would shout an order. A truck would rumble by on the road outside the wall. The spell would break. The psychological strain was immense. They were living in a vacuum. They had no news. They had no control. The only thing they had was the structure of the day. The breakfast, the lessons, the walk, the tea. It was a fragile shell, but it was the only thing keeping the darkness out. The children, the 4 girls with their shaved heads recovering from measles, and the boy with his fragile blood, adapted better than the adults. They played games. They put on plays. They laughed. It was the laughter of the doomed, bright and brittle. They had grown up in this isolation. To them, the palace was just a bigger version of the nursery. They did not know the world outside. They did not know how to live in it. But the world was closing in. The provisional government was weak. The Bolsheviks were rising. The angry rhetoric in the streets was getting louder. Kill the tyrant. Kill the parasites. The words drifted over the walls like poison gas. The guards grew bolder. They would enter the rooms without knocking. They would sit at the table uninvited. They would light cigarettes and blow smoke in the Tsarina's face. Through it all, Nicholas kept his diary. He wrote about the weather. Cloudy, rain, clear. He wrote about the books he read. He wrote about the work he did in the garden. He did not write about the terror that must have been gripping his heart. He did not write about the fate he knew was coming for his children. He maintained the facade of the English country gentleman at leisure. It was the only role he had left to play. The summer stretched on. The days got longer. The white nights of St. Petersburg arrived, that eerie twilight where the sun barely dips below the horizon. The palace was bathed in a pale, ghostly light until midnight. It made the confinement feel eternal, as if they had been suspended in amber. The order to move came in August. The provisional government, fearing a mob attack, decided to send them to Tobolsk in Siberia. It was meant to be for their safety. It was a lie. It was the next step in the procession toward the basement. But when they packed their bags, they did not pack for a tragedy. They packed for a long trip. They packed their clothes. They did not pack for a tragedy. They packed for a long trip. They packed their clothes, their books, their icons, their medicines. They packed the routine. They were taking the cage with them. As they left the Alexander Palace, the staff lined up to say goodbye. The maids, the footmen, the cooks. They were weeping. They knew that the world they lived in was ending. Nicholas looked at them, his face blank. He shook hands. He thanked them. He walked out to the car. He did not look back at the white columns of the palace. He did not look back at the park where he had chopped wood. He climbed into the seat. The door slammed shut. The engine started, and the car rolled away, carrying the former autocrats into the vast, indifferent geography of Russia, leaving behind only the smell of lilacs and the memory of a silence. The train pulled out of the station at Tsarskoye Selo in the dead of night. It was August 1917. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and coal smoke. Inside the carriages, the former imperial family sat in the dark, watching the lights of their home fade into the distance. They were leaving the cage, but they were not being freed. They were being moved to a deeper, colder cell. The journey was long. It was a slow, grinding crawl across the spine of Russia. The clicking of the wheels on the rails was a hypnotic, monotonous rhythm. Click, clack, click, clack. It went on for days. The inventory lists from the train tell a story of a desperate kind of hope. They had packed trunks, dozens of them, heavy wooden chests filled with linens, silver, porcelain, icons, and warm coats. They packed as if they were going on a long holiday to the country. They packed as if the world they knew still existed. But outside the windows, the world was on fire. The train passed through villages where the smoke was not from chimneys but from burning manor houses. They saw mobs in the fields. They saw the soldiers deserting, walking home in ragged groups, carrying their boots over their shoulders. The revolution was eating the countryside. But inside the train, the blinds were often drawn. The guards, a mix of loyalists and rough revolutionaries, ordered the windows shut. The family was hidden away, protected from the sight of their own ruin. Captain Kobylinski, the officer in charge of the escort, kept a journal. It is a document of exhaustion. He was a soldier, a man of duty, caught in a trap not of his own making. He wrote about the heat in the train cars, the smell of too many bodies in a confined space, the nervousness of the guards. He wrote about the Tsar. Nicholas walked up and down the platform during stops, smoking cigarettes, his face a mask of polite indifference. He chatted with the soldiers. He asked about their families. He seemed to believe that he was just an officer on a transport mission, not the victim of a historical abduction. The line ended at Tyumen. From there, the road ran out. The only way east was the river. They were loaded onto a steamer, the Rus, a dirty, cramped commercial vessel that smelled of fish and oil. This was the true crossing of the threshold. The Urals were behind them. They were entering Siberia. The water of the Tara River was black and slow. The steamer chugged along, pushing against the current. The air grew colder. The trees on the bank became sparser, smaller, twisted by the wind. Tobolsk was the destination. An old town, a forgotten outpost. It was built on a hill looking down over the vast, flat expanse of the Irtysh River. It had been the capital of Siberia 100 years before. Now, it was a place of exile, a place where the Russian state sent people it wanted to forget. It was here that the provisional government, in its infinite stumbling wisdom, decided to hide the Romanovs. They thought the distance would protect the family from the radical fury in Petrograd. They were wrong. Distance did not insulate the family from the fever. It only removed the doctors. The house was the governor's mansion, a solid 2-story brick building with peeling paint and a leaky roof. It was not a palace. It was a barracks with curtains. The windows were boarded up on the lower floor. The fence was high and rough. The guards were local workers and soldiers, men with calloused hands and bitter hearts. They did not see the little father. They saw a man who had lived in luxury while they starved. The inventory lists were unpacked. The silver brushes were placed on the dressers. The icons were hung in the corners. The family tried to colonize the space with their things. They tried to impose the routine of the Alexander Palace on this drafty foreign shell. But the cracks showed immediately. Kobylensky's journals detailed the daily erosion. The family woke up early. They prayed. They ate. But the food was different. It was coarse. Black bread, grains. The cooks from the palace were gone, replaced by army mess orderlies who didn't know how to boil an egg properly. Alexandra, the empress, sat at the table with her back straight, eating the gruel without complaint. But her eyes were hard. She was terrified. She was miles from anywhere. She was surrounded by enemies, and she was running out of medicine for her son. Alexei, the heir, was a boy in a glass body. The bumps of the journey had caused internal bleeding. He was bedridden for days. The inventory lists show the quantities of pain medication: aspirin, morphine. The supplies were dwindling. The boy lay on a folding cot, his face white as paper, his legs swollen and hot to the touch. Alexandra sat by him, knitting. The clicking of her needles was the only sound in the room, a frantic, nervous ticking. Nicholas, strangely, found a kind of peace. He was a man of the middle, and Tobolsk was a middle place. It wasn't the palace, but it wasn't the grave. He chopped wood. He shoveled snow. He cleared paths in the deep drifts. He worked until he sweated, stripping off his shirt, breathing the freezing air into his lungs. The guards watched him. Some mocked him. "Look at the bourgeois," they would say. "The bourgeois." But others, the older men, saw a man who was trying to maintain his dignity through labor. Kobylensky wrote that Nicholas seemed almost happy at times. He was free from the telegrams. He was free from the ministers. He was just a man with an axe. But the political reality was closing in. The provisional government in Petrograd was collapsing. The Bolsheviks were rising. The news that filtered through to Tobolsk was weeks old, distorted by distance and censorship. The family lived in a time lag. They heard about the October Revolution in November. They heard about the Bolsheviks taking power like a rumor from a distant country. They were cut off. The detachment was total. In Petrograd, Lenin and Trotsky were building a new world, a world that had no place for kings. In Tobolsk, the Romanovs were living a ghostly life. They read books. They played games. They put on plays in the evening. The Grand Duchesses acting out scenes from Chekhov, their voices ringing false in the bare room. They pretended that the world outside the fence was just waiting for them to return. The isolation bred a dangerous ignorance. They did not realize that the guards were changing. The disciplined soldiers of the early days were replaced by new men, rougher men, men who had been in the trenches, men who had been told that the Tsar was the cause of all their suffering. The dynamic in the house shifted. The politeness faded. The doors were no longer held open. The meals were slammed on the table. The soldiers would stand too close to the Grand Duchesses, staring, making lewd jokes under their breath. Kobylinski tried to maintain order. He was a buffer. He stood between the family and the mob, but he was getting pressure from both sides. The local Soviet, the Council of Workers in Tobolsk, wanted the family punished. They wanted to take their money. They wanted to take off their clothes. They wanted to humiliate them. Kobylinski wrote letters begging for instructions. He received none. The central government was too busy fighting for its life to worry about one family in the frozen east. Winter descended. It was a Siberian winter. The kind that freezes the breath in your throat. The river froze solid, a white road of ice. The snow piled up against the fence. The days grew short. The sun was a pale, weak disk that barely cleared the horizon. Inside the house, the cold was a constant enemy. The stoves ate wood ravenously. Nicholas and the girls hauled logs up from the yard. They wore layers of clothes. The inventory lists show the hats, the shawls, and the felt boots. The Romanovs were learning how to be cold. They were learning how to be uncomfortable. The letters they wrote during this time, smuggled out by loyal servants, speak of a strange serenity. They wrote about the beauty of the snow. They wrote about the kindness of the guards who were still kind. They did not write about the fear. They did not write about the hate. They were protecting themselves. They were building a wall of normalcy. But the wall was crumbling. The Bolsheviks had seized the telegraph office. The orders coming from the center were getting darker. Prevent escape. Strict regime. The net was tightening. The family was no longer just prisoners of the state. They were hostages. The move to Tobolsk was meant to save them from the mob, but it only delivered them to the executioners. By removing them from the public eye, the government made them invisible. When the terror came, there would be no cameras. There would be no reporters. There would be no witnesses. By removing them from the public eye, the government made them invisible. When the terror came, there would be no cameras. There would be no reporters. There would be no witnesses. Just the snow, the silence, and the dark. One night, a guard drunkenly tried to enter the daughter's room. The scandal was hushed up, but the fear remained, a cold, slick fear that settled in the stomach. Kobylinski increased the patrol. He locked the doors himself. He looked at the Tsar sitting in the hallway on a folding chair, staring at the floor. Nicholas looked small. He looked old. He looked like a man who knew that the ground was crumbling beneath his feet, but he could not see the bottom of the pit. The river Irtysh creaked and groaned as the ice shifted. The wind howled around the corners of the governor's mansion. The Romanovs huddled in their rooms reading old books, wearing old clothes, living in the past. The present was a nightmare they refused to acknowledge, and the future was a train, waiting on a siding in the dark, with the engine running, pointed toward the Urals. The train hissed to a stop in the middle of the night. It was late April 1918. The air that seeped in through the cracks of the carriage did not smell of pine or damp earth. It smelled of sulfur. It smelled of coal dust and hot metal. This was Ekaterinburg, a factory town, a place of smoke and noise encircled by the low, dark hills of the Ural Mountains. The Romanovs stepped off the train onto the wet platform. They were tired. They were confused. They were no longer guests of the state, or even political prisoners in the traditional sense. They were cargo, the local Soviet, the Council of Workers and soldiers that ran this grim industrial city, had been waiting for them. They had been arguing with Moscow for weeks. Moscow wanted the family moved further east, perhaps to a safer location. But the Ural Soviet wanted them here. They wanted the former tyrant under their thumb. They wanted to make a statement. They were the hard men of the revolution, the men who had stood in the lines and taken the bullets, and they did not trust the soft intellectuals in the capital to deal with the enemy properly. The family was loaded into a tarantass, the rough, springless carts used in the provinces. The ride was short and brutal. The wheels churned in the mud. The guards sat on the trunks, their rifles poking into the air. They drove through the dark streets, past the shuttered windows of the merchant houses, past the church spires that rose like needles into the sky, until they reached a large, white building standing on a slope of Voznesensky Square. It was the house of a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. He had been given 2 days to pack his things and get out. The Bolsheviks needed a place to keep the Romanovs. They took his home. They turned it into a prison. The first thing you noticed was the fence. It was a high wooden palisade thrown up in a hurry. It was rough green lumber, nailed together, sealing the house off from the street. It rose past the second-floor windows, cutting off the view. It created a box, a sealed container in the middle of the city. On the gate, a sign was posted, a sign that gave the place its new name, the House of Special Purpose. The name itself was a chilling bureaucratic joke. It sounded technical. It sounded administrative. But the purpose was clear. This was not a living house. It was a house for holding. The commissariat orders from that week detailed the transition. The family was to be stripped of all luxuries. They were no longer to be treated with the deference accorded to royalty. They were prisoners of the revolution. The logbook of the house, a thick, ledger-like tome, began to fill with the mundane details of their incarceration. Arrived at 0930, belongings searched, ring confiscated. Inside, the house was stifling. The Ipatiev house was solid, built of stone and brick, but it felt cramped. The family was given a suite of rooms on the second floor. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, peeling in the corners. The furniture was a mismatch of what Ipatiev had left behind and what the guards had dragged in. It was shabby. It was dirty. Nicholas and Alexandra shared a bedroom. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, shared a room next door. Alexei, the sick boy, was given a small room, but he spent most of his time with his parents. The floors were bare wood. The windows were painted over with white paint, leaving only a small strip at the top to let in the light. The atmosphere was thick with tension. In Tobolsk, there had been a semblance of respect. Captain Kobelinsky had been a gentleman. Here, the commandant was a man named Avdiv, a factory worker, a man with a red beard and a loud, vulgar voice. He and his guards treated the family with a studied rudeness. They burst into the rooms without knocking. They smoked cigarettes and dropped the ashes on the floor. They sat on the beds. They stared at the Grand Duchesses with a hungry, mocking look. The orders from the Ural Soviet were specific. The family was to be isolated. No letters, no visitors. The food was to be simple. Soldiers' rations, black bread, grains, soup made from nettles and potato peels. The logbook records the meals: macaroni, kvass, cutlets. The portions were small. The family was hungry. The psychological shift was immediate and violent. In the Alexander Palace, they had been under house arrest, but it was their house. In Tobolsk, they had been exiles, but they had built a routine. Here, they were trapped in a box with their enemies. The guards were everywhere. They ate at the same table. They stood in the hallways. They listened to every word. Nicholas tried to maintain his composure. He walked in the small garden inside the palisade. He chopped wood. But the garden was tiny. The walls were high. The guards watched him from the porch, making comments about his axe work. He was no longer the Tsar. He was just a man with a bald spot and a beard, sweating in the spring sun, being mocked by his own people. The commissars wanted to assert control. They wanted to break the imperial arrogance. They argued over the smallest things. Nicholas wanted his gold chain returned. The guards refused. Alexandra wanted a certain chair for her back. The guards laughed. The logbook records these small, petty battles. Request denied. Item removed. The cruelty was in the details. The guards would draw obscene pictures on the bathroom walls. They would sing revolutionary songs loudly outside the bedroom doors at night. They would count the family like cattle multiple times a day. The aim was to strip away the humanity, to reduce them to objects. Alexandra, struggling with her health and her nerves, found it hardest. She stayed in bed. She clutched her icons. She prayed. The room was hot. The air was stale. She could hear the trams rattling by on the street outside, but she could not see them. She could hear the factory whistles blowing, marking the shifts. The sounds of the new world, the workers' world, penetrate the walls of her prison. The transfer to Ekaterinburg was a political statement. The Ural Soviet was dominated by Bolsheviks who saw the Romanovs not as a bargaining chip but as a liability. As long as the Tsar lived, he was a banner for the counter-revolution. The White armies were gathering in the east. The Czechoslovak Legion was moving along the railway. The net was closing in on the revolution. The local commissars wanted to ensure that the symbol of the old order did not survive. By July, the commandant changed. Avdiv was removed, suspected of stealing from the family's luggage. He was replaced by Yakov Yurovsky, a man of a different cut entirely. He was a Chekist, a member of the secret police. He was cold, efficient, and utterly loyal to the party. He walked through the house with a permanent scowl. He checked the locks. He checked the guards. He carried a Mauser pistol on his hip. The logbook entries under Yurovsky became shorter, sharper. The routine tightened. The walks in the garden were shortened. The meals became worse. The guards were rotated, brought in from the factories, men who did not know the family, men who saw them only as parasites. The house itself began to close in. The high fence cast a permanent shadow over the yard. The windows, painted over, gave the rooms a twilight gloom even at midday. The smell of the place was a mix of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and the metallic tang of fear. They were cut off from the world. The telegrams from Moscow were cryptic. Watch them closely. Prevent escape. The Ural Soviet was making its own plans. They were preparing for a final solution to the Romanov question. They wanted to act before the Whites reached the city. They wanted to be the ones to pull the trigger. In the evenings, the family would sit in the dining room. They would read the Bible. They would play cards. They tried to ignore the guards staring at them through the doorway. They tried to ignore the rough voices, the curse words, the spitting on the floor. They held on to each other. They were all they had left. One night, the soldiers in the house got drunk. They gathered in the garden and fired their rifles into the air, shouting threats against the bloodsuckers. The family huddled in their rooms, listening to the screams and the laughter. Alexandra sat on the edge of her bed, her face white. Nicholas stood by the door, his hand on the wood, listening. He did not open it. To the screams and the laughter, Alexandra sat on the edge of her bed, her face white. Nicholas stood by the door, his hand on the wood, listening. He did not open it. He knew he could not stop them. The prisoners were at the mercy of the jailers, and the jailers were losing their mercy. The House of Special Purpose was a waiting room for death. It was a place where the administrative machinery of the state ground down the human soul. The Ural Soviet had gotten what they wanted. They had the Tsar. They had him locked away, hidden behind a high wooden fence, isolated from the shifting tides of the war. They had created a vacuum, a sealed chamber where the rules of the outside world did not apply. The last entry in the family's own records, a simple note in a diary, mentions the weather. It mentions a book read. It does not mention the fear that was choking them. It does not mention the trucks that were beginning to rumble through the city at night. It does not mention the cellar. That would come later. For now, there was only the house, the white paint on the windows, the smell of boiled cabbage, the sound of boots on the stairs, and the silence of the prisoners waiting in the dark for the door to open. 1918. Outside, the Urals were waking up. The snow had melted into thick black mud. The birch trees were budding. The sun was staying up later, stretching the days into those long, white northern twilights. But inside the Ipatiev house, the season was being erased. A guard climbed a ladder. He carried a bucket of whitewash and a rough brush. He slopped the paint onto the glass, layer after layer. He was ordered to seal the view. He was ordered to blind them. The family stood inside, watching the light turn milky, then gray, then vanish completely. The windows were painted over, leaving only a small high strip of clear glass at the very top, a strip that showed nothing but a patch of indifferent sky. This was the silent siege. It was a war of small, suffocating increments. The goal was not just to hold them, but to break them, to peel away the layers of their identity until only the raw, exposed nerve of fear remained. The house became a world of shadows. Without the view, the family lost their sense of time. They lost their connection to the world outside. They could hear the trams rattling by on Voznesensky Avenue. They could hear the factory whistles blowing the shifts. They could hear the distant shouts of the city. But they could not see it. They were ghosts in their own lives, haunting the second floor of a merchant's house. The letters from the children to their former tutors, smuggled out in the linings of coats or hidden in milk bottles, speak of a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of normalcy. Olga, the eldest, wrote in a neat, practiced hand. She wrote about the books they were reading. She wrote about the weather, guessing at it from the temperature of the air coming through the cracks. She wrote about the friendly guards, trying to convince herself, or perhaps the reader, that they were still human beings worthy of respect. But the reality on the page betrays the intent. The handwriting is shaky. The sentences are short. "We are well," she wrote. A lie. "We are not bored." Another lie. The letters are filled with a forced, brittle cheerfulness that crumbles under the weight of the censor's eye. They were writing for the guard who would read it first. They were performing their own captivity. The meal inventories from the spring of 1918 tell a darker story. There are lists of scarcity. In the Alexandra Palace, the inventories had listed vintage wines, imported chocolates, and fresh game from the forests. Here, the lists were blunt. Black bread, macaroni, nettles. The cook, a man named Karatonov, did his best. He tried to make soup from whatever the commissars allowed through the gate, but the quality was dropping. The guards, rough men from the local factories and the Red Army, delighted in the degradation. They would deliver the rations with a sneer. "Here, eat like the workers," they would say, throwing a sack of flour onto the table. The flour was often mixed with dust or sawdust. The bread was sour and heavy. The family sat down to eat. Nicholas is at the head, Alexandra at the foot, the four girls on the sides. The table was set with the mismatched china they had brought from Tobolsk. They held their spoons correctly. They sat with their backs straight. It was a ritual, a defense. If they could eat like human beings, they could pretend they were still human beings. But the hunger gnawed at them. It made them irritable. It made them weak. Alexei, the young heir, was still bedridden for long stretches. His joint was swollen. The inventory lists show the medical supplies: aspirin, iodine. But the doctors were gone. The specialists were gone. The only medical help came from a sympathetic guard or a former sailor named Nagorny, who had stayed with them. Alexandra, with her bad heart and her sciatica, sat in a wheelchair, wincing with every jolt of the uneven floorboards. The psychological warfare was relentless. It was in the silence, and it was in the noise. The guards were ordered to harass them. It was policy. It was fun. The logbook records the shifts. New guards came in. They were hungrier, angrier, and less disciplined than the first batch. They would sit in the corridor outside the bedrooms. They would smoke cheap tobacco, filling the stale air with a thick, acrid haze. They would sing lewd songs. They would play cards and shout at each other. They made sure the family heard every word. There was no privacy. The doors were not allowed to be locked. A guard could walk in at any moment. He could demand to see what they were writing. He could demand to search their pockets. He could just stand there, staring at the daughters. The grand duchesses, who had once been the prizes of Europe, were now trapped in a cage with men who looked at them like meat. Nicholas tried to intervene. He was a man of protocol even now. He complained to the commandant. He wrote notes. He asked for the windows to be cleaned. He asked for the guards to be cleaned. He asked for the guards to be quiet. The notes were ignored. The commandant, Yarovsky, a man with cold eyes and a tidy uniform, looked at the former Tsar with a mix of hatred and professional detachment. He did not care about the comfort of the prisoners. He cared about their containment. The physical space of the house shrank. In Tobolsk, they had a garden. They had the river. They had the town. Here, they had a small patch of yard behind the high wooden fence. They were allowed to walk there for a few minutes a day. The garden was a ruin. It was muddy and trampled. The soldiers used it as a latrine. The smell was foul, but they went out anyway. They needed the air. Nicholas would pace back and forth, his hands behind his back, his head down. He was wearing a soldier's tunic. He looked like a tired officer on a bad posting. The girls would follow him. They tried to identify the weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement. They tried to find a moment of peace. But even there, the siege followed them. The guards stood on the porch and watched. They made comments. They laughed. They aimed their rifles playfully at the Tsar's back. The family pretended not to hear. They kept their eyes on the ground. They learned to look at nothing. The mental strain began to show. Alexandra spent more and more time in her room. She prayed. She read the Bible. She grew thinner. Her face was drawn. She had lost her regal bearing. She looked like what she was, a sick woman trapped in a nightmare. She wrote in her diary, pages that would later be torn and burned, about the humiliation. She wrote about the loss of dignity. She wrote about the fear that the guards would break in at night. The children tried to distract themselves. They had a few books. They had a guitar. They tried to sing, but the songs died in their throats. The atmosphere was too heavy. The oppression was physical. It pressed down on the chest. It made it hard to breathe. The removal of the Little Father image was complete. The guards would often tell them the news from the front. "The Reds are winning," they would say with a grin. "The Whites are running." They wanted to see the despair on Nicholas's face. They wanted him to know that his world was dead and that he was the last relic of it. There was a specific incident, recorded in the memories of the survivors, that captures the petty cruelty of the siege. One of the guards drew an obscene picture on the wall of the bathroom. It was a caricature of the Tsar and Tsarina. The family saw it. They said nothing. They could not erase it. They had to live with it. They had to use the room, knowing that their tormentors had marked the walls with filth. The inventories of their belongings grew shorter. The commissars were stealing from them, a gold chain here, a diamond brooch there. They knew the family had hidden jewels in their clothes. The guards searched them roughly. They felt the seams of the corsets. They confiscated the weapons, the hunting knives, the ceremonial daggers that Nicholas had collected. They were stripping the house, and they were stripping the people. The silent siege was a form of torture. It was the slow, steady drip of water on stone. It was designed to make them grateful for the smallest kindness. A guard who let them walk an extra 5 minutes in the yard became a hero. A soldier who brought a bit of butter for the bread became a savior. It warped their perspective. It made them docile. They were waiting. That was the hardest part. They were waiting for something to happen. A rescue, a trial, a miracle. They did not know. They were cut off from the political currents swirling around them. They did not know that the Czechoslovak Legion was moving east, threatening Ekaterinburg. They did not know that Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership in Moscow were debating their fate. They did not know that the Ural Soviet had already decided to kill them. The house grew hotter as summer arrived. The painted windows, bodies, the sour smell of illness, the smell of the dirty latrines in the yard, all mixed together. It was the smell of the end. They slept with their clothes on. They slept with their boots by the bed. They were ready to move, they thought. They were ready for the next stage. They did not know that there was no next stage. There was only the cellar. The letters home stopped. There was nothing left to say. The lies had run dry. The children sat in the dim light of the painted windows, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They listened to the guards arguing in the next room. They listened to the clock ticking on the wall. They listened to the silence of a world that had forgotten them, and outside, the white nights of the Urals began. The sun would barely dip below the horizon, leaving the sky a pale, sleepless gray. It illuminated the tops of the trees, the church spires, the smokestacks of the factories. It was a beautiful, cruel summer. But in the house of special purpose, it was always night. The paint on the windows sought of that, a thick, white crust of silence. And the family sat in the dark, waiting for the knock on the door. The night was heavy. It was July 16th, 1918. The air in Ekaterinburg was thick, pressing down on the city, trapping the smoke and the dust. Inside the Ipatiev house, the silence was a physical thing. It pressed against the ears. The guards were quiet. The usual songs and shouting had stopped. A strange, tense calm had settled over the house of special purpose. This was not the calm of peace. It was the calm of a trap being set. The Bolshevik Revolution was fighting for its life. The Civil War was tearing the country apart. To the east, the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and Democrats, was closing in. They were near. Just a few miles away, the Czechoslovak Legion was moving along the railway, threatening to take the city. The Whites wanted the Tsar. They wanted to restore the old order. For Lenin and the central leadership in Moscow, the Tsar was no longer just a prisoner. He was a banner, a living rallying point for the enemy. The order came in the form of a coded telegram. It was a bureaucratic death sentence. The local Ural Soviet had been pushing for it. They argued that the Tsar could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the Whites. If he escaped, the revolution would be crushed. Moscow agreed. The decision was cold. It was calculated. It was political. This was not a spontaneous act of a mob. It was a strategic amputation. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, received the order. He was a man of precision, a Chekist. He did not flinch. He spent the day making preparations. He checked the logistics. He selected the room, a semi-basement room on the ground floor. It had a single window, barred and bricked up. It was empty. The walls were plastered. The floor was wooden. He summoned the executioners. He picked men he trusted, men who would not hesitate. He told them to be ready. He told them to check their weapons. At midnight, the routine began. The family went to bed. The logs in the stoves burned low. The guard rotation changed. Yurovsky was on edge. He paced the hallway. He had to wait for the trucks, the vehicles that would take the bodies away. The logistics of disappearance are complicated. Around 1:30 a.m., Yurovsky moved. He woke the family physician, Dr. Botkin. He told him to wake the others. The excuse was the same one they had used before. The Whites were coming. The city was not safe. The family needed to be moved to the basement for their own protection. It was a lie designed to control the panic, to keep them docile. The family dressed quickly. Nicholas pulled on his trousers. Alexandra put on a simple dress. The daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, dressed. They gathered their things. They thought they were leaving. They thought this was just another miserable transport in a long line of transports. They went downstairs. They walked in a group. Nicholas carried Alexei. The boy was in his sailor suit, his cap in his hand. He could not walk well. The journey from Tobolsk had been too much for him. They descended the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under their weight. Yurovsky led them to the basement room. It was cold. It smelled of damp plaster. There was no furniture. Yurovsky ordered chairs to be brought in. 2 wooden chairs. Alexandra sat in one. She was frail, her back hurting. Alexei was placed in the other. Nicholas stood behind him. The daughters stood against the wall. Dr. Botkin stood by the door. They waited. They thought the trucks were coming to take them away. They did not know that the trucks were for the bodies. Yurovsky entered the room. He was followed by the execution squad. 10 men. They filled the doorway. They held revolvers, nagants, Mausers. The room was small. The air was close. Yurovsky stepped forward. He held a piece of paper. He read the sentence. It was short. He told them that the Ural Soviet had sentenced them to death. Nicholas looked up. He did not seem to understand. He turned to the family. He said, "What? What?" Yurovsky did not wait for a discussion. He raised his hand. He shouted the command, "Shoot them!" The room exploded. It was not a single shot. It was a volley, a roar of thunder in a sealed box. The muzzles flashed. The smoke filled the air instantly, thick and acrid, smelling of sulfur and burnt powder. The noise was deafening. It bounced off the walls, making it impossible to hear the screams. Nicholas fell first. He was hit in the chest. He crumpled to the floor. Alexei, the boy in the chair, was shot next. The bullets tore into him. The sickly air, the hope of the dynasty, died where he sat. The daughters and Alexandra tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was a box. The bullets flew everywhere. The chaos lasted for seconds, but it felt like hours. The shooting stopped. The smoke hung heavy. The room was silent, save for the groans. Some of them were still alive. The Yurovsky note, the account written by the executioner years later, explains why. The daughters had sewn diamonds into their corsets. They had hidden the family jewels in their undergarments, hoping to smuggle them out. The thick layers of cloth and gems acted like armor. The bullets bounced off. They deflected. Yurovsky saw this. He saw the twitching bodies. He heard the heavy breathing. He ordered the men to finish it. It became a slaughter. The soldiers moved in. They used their bayonets. They used their rifle butts. They shot them at point-blank range. The violence was intimate. It was messy. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, soaking into the cracks. It was thick and dark. The inquest reports from 1919, conducted by the White Army investigators who later found the house, described the scene. They found bullet holes in the walls. They found blood spattered on the wainscoting. They found evidence of the struggle. A finger pressed into the plaster where someone had tried to brace themselves. A heel mark where a boot had scraped the floor. It was over. The Romanovs were dead. The autocracy was extinct. But the final act was not just the killing. It was the erasure. The political decision to kill was followed by the political decision to disappear. Yurovsky supervised the removal. The bodies were stripped. The clothes were burned. The diamonds were pried from the corsets with bayonets. The valuables were collected in a pile. They were items of state, now just loot. The bodies were loaded onto a truck, a Fiat truck with a rough suspension. They drove them out of the city. They drove them into the forest. The plan was to drop them down a mine shaft, but the shaft was too shallow, or the water was too high. The bodies were visible. They had to try again. They moved them again to a clearing in the forest called Porosenkov Log. It was a boggy, muddy place. The ground was soft. They built a fire. They tried to burn the bodies. They poured sulfuric acid on the faces to destroy the features, to make them unrecognizable. They did not want shrines. They did not want relics. The work was hard. The acid hissed. The fire crackled. The smell was horrific. Burning flesh. Chemicals. The men worked quickly. They were tired. They were covered in dirt and blood. 2 bodies were burned separately. Alexei and Maria, or perhaps Anastasia. The details are murky. The rest were thrown into a shallow pit. They were covered with railroad ties, then covered with earth, then driven over by trucks to flatten the ground. The goal was to make what everyone feared. It was not a mob. It was a state action. The political calculation had worked. The whites lost their rallying point. The monarchists lost their king. The symbol was gone. The body was gone. In the basement of the Ipatieff house, the investigators found a wall that had been scrubbed clean. They found a whitewashed patch where a bullet had chipped the brick. The room was empty. Just 4 walls and a floor. The air was still. The silence had returned. But this time it was absolute. The silence of a finished story. The silence of a history that had been cut short and buried in a muddy pit in the Urals, under the weight of heavy ties in the dark, indifferent earth. The truck groaned under the weight. It was a Fiat, a mechanical beast imported before the war, now repurposed for a job that no engineer had ever intended. The suspensions sagged. The tires sank into the soft black earth of the Urals. It was the early morning hours of July 17, 1918. The air in the forest was cold, a sharp contrast to the heat of the basement room left behind. The trees here were thick, pine and birch, standing like silent witnesses in the dark. The truck carried a cargo that the New World wanted to forget. Yakov Yurovsky sat in the cab. He was holding a map, but in the darkness, the paper was just a rectangle of shadow. He knew where he was going, or at least he thought he did. He was looking for a place called Ganina Yama, the Four Brothers Mine. It was an old open-pit mine, a scar in the earth where iron had once been pulled from the ground. Now, it was to be a tomb. The Bolsheviks had killed the body. Now they had to kill the memory. The fear was not of the living Romanovs. It was one of the dead ones. In a country as deeply religious as Russia, the bones of a saint held power. The bodies of martyrs could start revolutions. If the White Army, the counter-revolutionaries, found the remains, they would not just bury them. They would enshrine them. They would build a cathedral. The Tsar's grave would become a rallying point, a holy site where the faithful would kneel and swear oaths to restore the crown. Yurovsky understood this. He was a pragmatist, a materialist, but he understood the power of the relic. He had to make sure there was no relic to find. The truck stopped. The engine ticked as it cooled. The mine was ahead, a dark, gaping mouth in the forest floor. The guards jumped down. They were dirty, sweating, their uniforms stained with the work of the night. They opened the back of the truck. The bodies were there, piled together, limbs tangled. The white dresses of the girls are now red and brown. The yellow of the Tsarevich's sailor suit darkened with old blood. The smell hit them, a heavy, metallic scent, copper and voided bowels. It hung in the cold air. They dragged the bodies to the edge of the shaft. It was hard work. The ground was uneven. The roots of the trees grabbed at their boots. They stripped the clothes. They needed the clothes to burn. They needed the jewelry. The diamonds sewn into the corsets, the same diamonds that had deflected the bullets, were pried out with bayonets. The metal scraped against bone. The sound was dull in the silence of the forest. They threw the bodies down the shaft, one by one. They heard them hit the bottom, a thud, a crack of wood where a beam broke. They threw in the clothes. They poured on gasoline. They poured on sulfuric acid. The acid was in heavy glass carboys. They smashed them against the rocks. The liquid hissed as it hit the organic matter. It was a sound like frying meat. Yurovsky stood on the edge. He watched the fire catch. The smoke rose, gray and oily, twisting through the pine branches. He wanted the bodies gone, dissolved. He wanted to melt the flesh from the bone, to turn the Romanovs into a chemical sludge that could be washed away by the rain. But the mine was wet. The fire sputtered. The acid pooled but did not consume the bone entirely. The geography was fighting him. The earth of the Urals is stubborn. It holds on to things. Dawn was coming. The sky in the east was turning a pale, watery gray. Yurovsky knew that the smoke would be seen. The locals would talk. The whites were getting closer. The first attempt at erasure had failed. The pit was too shallow. The fire was too slow. He ordered the bodies pulled out. This was the part that breaks the mind. Men going down into a pit of half-burned corpses, using hooks, using ropes, dragging the charred remains back up to the surface. The smell was now worse. The smell of burned hair, burned skin, the acid biting at their own hands. They loaded them back onto the truck. They drove deeper into the forest. They were looking for a deeper mine, a place called Porosenkov Log, the Piglets Ravine. It was a boggy, marshy place. The ground was soft, the mud was thick and greedy. The truck got stuck. The wheels spun. The mud splattered the chassis. It would not move. Yurovsky looked at his watch. The sun was up. They were out of time. They could not drive any further. They had to finish it here. They dragged the bodies off the truck. They laid them on the grass. They dug a hole. But the water table was high. The hole filled with water as fast as they dug. It was a soup of mud and clay. They decided to bury them right there. But first, the final mutilation. The forensic reports from the 1990s would later tell the story of this moment. They found the skulls. They were crushed. The faces were destroyed. Yurovsky ordered the faces beaten in with rifle butts and shovels. He did not want them identified. Not now. Not ever. If the whites found the grave, they would see only bone. No face. No features. Just a pile of anonymous dead. They poured more acid. They set fire to the remains again. They wanted to reduce the mass. They wanted to make the evidence disappear into the soil. The fire burned low. The bones were charred and black. Some were fragments. Some were whole. They shoved them into the watery pit. They threw railroad ties on top. Heavy wooden beams soaked in creosote. They drove the truck back and forth over the grave to pack the earth down. The engine roared in the quiet forest. The tires churned the mud until the ground was flat, until the grave was invisible. Then they left. They drove away, leaving the forest to its silence. The erasure was done, or so they thought. For 70 years the secret held. The Soviet Union rose on the bones of the Romanovs. The forest grew back. The pine needles covered the mud. The grass grew over the railroad ties. Danina Yama, the mine where they first tried to burn the bodies, became a site of pilgrimage for the faithful. They did not know the bodies were not there. They prayed to the empty earth. They felt the presence of the martyrs. The very effort to destroy the relic had created a vacuum that faith rushed to fill. But the earth remembers. In the late 1970s, an amateur historian named Alexander Abdinin and a writer named Jelly Ryabov found the spot. They found the railroad ties. They found a few bones. They took a skull. They hid it. They were afraid. The Soviet state was still strong. To admit the murder, to admit the location, was still dangerous. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the real excavation began. The forensic anthropological reports from that time are a catalog of horror and science. They mapped the grave. They found the skeletons. But they found a puzzle. There were not 11 bodies. There were 9. The Tsar, the Tsarina, the 3 daughters, Dr. Botkin, the cook, the footman. They were there. The bones were charred. The skulls were crushed. The acid had pitted the surface of the bone, leaving a rough, porous texture. But Alexei was missing, and one of the daughters, Maria or Anastasia, was missing. The maps of the forest, the search patterns, the DNA tests. They all pointed to the same conclusion. The erasure was not complete. Yurovsky, in his meticulous note, had written that he burned two bodies separately, the boy and the girl. He did not have time to burn them all completely, so he tried to destroy the two that mattered most for the succession. The heir, the potential bearer of the next generation. He burned them on a separate pyre. He crushed their bones to ash. But even that failed. In 2007, a few hundred yards away from the main grave, another pit was found. Fragments, teeth, a shard of bone. The forensic reports confirmed it. The missing children. The chemical analysis showed the same traces of acid, the same heat damage. The Bolsheviks had tried to make the Romanovs vanish. They tried to melt them into the landscape. They tried to scrub the history from the map, but the ground gave up the truth, the white bone in the black mud, a fragment of the past that refused to dissolve. The water was freezing. It was February 1920, in the heart of Berlin. The Landwehr Canal was a slurry of ice and industrial sludge. A woman stood on the edge, or perhaps she fell. The details are muddy, like the water itself. She was pulled out, shivering, choking on the filth of the city. She had no papers. She had no name. She refused to speak. She was taken to the Daldorf Asylum. They put her in a ward for the insane. They called her Fraulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. She was a broken thing. Her body was scarred. There were marks on her chest, her feet, her arms. She was thin. Her hair was chopped short, and her eyes were hollow. She sat in the corner of the white room, staring at the wall. She looked like a survivor of the war, of which there were millions. Germany was full of ghosts then. Displaced people, wounded soldiers, women with nowhere to go. But then, in 1922, a rumor began to circulate among the Russian émigrés living in Berlin. A rumor that started as a whisper and grew into a shout. A patient in the asylum looked like the daughter of the Tsar. Not the eldest Olga or the tall, elegant Tatiana. She looked like Anastasia. The name was a spell. Anastasia Romanov, the fourth daughter, the spirited one. The one who was known for her mischief, for making funny faces, for hiding in cupboards and jumping out to scare the servants. If any of them had survived the basement, it would be her. It was a story that was too perfect to ignore. A princess, lost in the gutter waiting to be found. When the visitors came, the woman in the bed changed. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She lay there, covered in blankets, hiding her face. She was playing a game, or perhaps she was trapped in a delusion. The visitors brought photographs. They brought stories. They brought the scent of the old world into the sterile hospital air. She began to talk. She spoke Russian with an accent, or perhaps she didn't speak Russian at all, preferring German. The details were contradictory. The memory is a treacherous thing, even for a sane person. For a woman who had tried to drown herself in a canal, it was a chaos of half-remembered phrases and borrowed dreams. The myth took hold because the reality was too hard to bear. The murder of the entire family was a horror that the world struggled to digest. The shooting of the Tsar was a political act. The shooting of the Tsarita and the children was a massacre. It was a crime that defied the natural order. People wanted a loophole. They wanted a miracle. They wanted Anastasia to live. The woman became Anna Anderson. She became the most famous imposter in history. But to call her just an imposter is to miss the point. She became a vessel, a canvas upon which the grief of a generation was projected. She was the survivor. She was the hope that the line had not been extinguished in the mud of the forest. The court transcripts from the trials that spanned decades read like a grotesque novel. There were hundreds of witnesses, servants who swore she was the Grand Duchess, relatives who swore she was a stranger, friends of the family who wept on the stand, their memories bending to the shape of their desire. The arguments were intense. They focused on the small details: a mole on the shoulder, a scar on the forehead, the shape of the ears. the hallux valgus, the bunions on her feet, which Anastasia had inherited from her mother. Anna Anderson knew things that a peasant from Poland should not know. She knew the layout of the Winter Palace. She knew the nicknames of the family dogs. She knew the inside jokes, but she also got things wrong. She forgot the names of tutors. She mixed up events. She was vague about the night of the murder. She claimed she had been bayoneted but survived. She claimed a soldier had taken pity on her and dragged her out of the truck. It was a story of impossible luck, of miraculous survival. It was the stuff of folklore. The dental records became the battleground of the experts. In the 1920s and 30s, forensic science was in its infancy, but it was brought to bear on the woman in the asylum. Doctors measured her jaw. They looked at her teeth. They compared them to the dental charts of the Romanov children. The Tsarina had been particular about her children's teeth. There were records, detailed handwritten notes by the dentist. The comparison was damning. The Romanov girls had wide, square jaws. Anna Anderson had a narrow, tapered jaw. The teeth did not match the x-rays. Science said no. The dentist said no. But the believers did not care about science. They cared about the feeling in their gut. They looked at her eyes, and they saw the ghost of the empire. The deep cultural reluctance to accept the extinction was a powerful force. To admit that Anna Anderson was a fake was to admit that the children were truly dead, that they had been shot, beaten, burned, and dissolved in acid, that there was no escape, that the cruelty had been absolute. It was a truth too heavy for many to carry. It was easier to believe the fairy tale. It was easier to believe that the little girl had slipped through the fingers of the executioners and was waiting in a German hospital to reclaim her throne. Anna Anderson lived a long life in the shadow of the claim. She was moved from asylum to castle to apartment. She was supported by wealthy patrons who wanted to be close to the rightful empress. She was hounded by reporters. She was analyzed by psychiatrists. She was bitter, angry, and difficult. She fought for recognition in the courts for over 30 years. She wanted the fortune. She wanted the name. And in the end, the truth came not from a judge, but from a laboratory. The forensic reports from the 1990s, the same reports that identified the bones in the forest, delivered the final verdict. The skeletons of the Romanovs were found. They were identified by DNA, but the scientists had kept samples. Years after Anna Anderson died in 1984, a sample of her tissue, taken during an operation and stored in a hospital in Virginia, was tested. The results were stark. They compared her DNA to the DNA of the Romanov family. There was no match. She was not Anastasia. She was not a Romanov. She was not a miracle. Then they compared her DNA to a different family, a family in Poland, the Shanskowskis. The match was perfect. The woman pulled from the canal in Berlin was Franziska Shanskowska, a Polish factory worker. She had been born in a village near the German border. She had worked in a munitions plant during the war. She had suffered a traumatic brain injury when a grenade exploded in her factory. She had been hospitalized for mental illness. She had disappeared from her home in 1920. Around the same time, the unknown woman jumped into the canal in Berlin. Franziska was 20 years younger than Anastasia. She was of a different class, a different world. But the trauma had shattered her mind. She had lost her identity, and, in the desperate, grieving world of the Russian diaspora, she had found a new one. She had absorbed the stories of the survivors around her. She had learned the language of the court. She had become the space where a dead princess used to be. The reveal of her true identity did not shatter the myth for everyone. There are still people who believe the story of Anastasia is too strong to be killed by a test tube. It has been retold in movies, in cartoons, in plays. It is The Princess and the Pea, adapted for the age of revolutions. It is the hope that innocence can survive the machine gun. But the reality is darker. The reality is that there was no rescue. There was no cart driver who saved the girl. There was no cart driver who saved the girl. The dental records were right. The bones in the forest were right. The historical argument stands firm. The persistence of Anna Anderson was not a mystery to be solved, but a symptom of a wound that refused to heal. The world looked at the horror of the basement and said, "No, not this, not her." And in that refusal, a Polish factory worker became a Russian saint. She lived a life of illusion, propped up by the denial of a century, and when she died as she had lived, a ghost of a story that never happened. The body had turned to dust, a sad, strange echo of a murder that the world was too afraid to accept. The laboratory was quiet. It was a silence made of white walls and filtered air, a silence that hummed with the sound of refrigeration units and the low, steady beep of machines that look at things smaller than the eye can see. It was the 1990s. The Soviet Union was gone, collapsed into a pile of administrative rubble. But the work in this room was about picking up the pieces of a much older collapse. The bones had been pulled from the mud. They had been cleaned. They had been catalogued. Skulls with crushed faces. Pelvises riddled with bullet holes. The skeletons of the servants, the doctor, and the family, they were laid out on metal tables. But in the world of modern history, a bone is just a bone until the chemistry says otherwise. The primary sources here were not written in ink. They were written in nucleotides, in the spiraling chains of DNA. The genetic studies conducted by the University of Moscow and the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab in the United States were the final chapter. The detectives of the 20th century were taking over the case from the executioners of the 20th century. The scientists needed a key, a baseline. You can look at a skull and see a resemblance, but resemblance is subjective. It is soft. It can be manipulated. DNA is a hard master. It does not lie. To prove that the bones in the first grave belonged to the Romanov family, the scientists needed to find a relative, a bloodline that stretched back to the same source. They went looking for a living ghost. They found one in the British royal family. The Tsarina Alexandra was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Her sister was the grandmother of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. He was a direct maternal relative. His mitochondria would carry the same genetic signature as the Tsarina and her children. The prince gave a blood sample. It was a small vial of red liquid, drawn in a sterile room in London. It was flown to the labs. The scientists extracted the mitochondrial DNA. They looked at the sequence. It was a string of chemical letters, a barcode of biology. Then they drilled into the bones. The sound of the drill in the lab is a grinding noise. It bites into the femur, into the dense calcium that holds the history of the body. They extracted the ancient DNA. It was fragmented, damaged by 70 years of acid, mud, and water. But it was there. They ran the comparison. The numbers aligned. The barcode matched. The bones in the first grave were indeed those of the Tsarina and the 3 daughters. The genetic evidence showed a mother and her children. The specific mutation, a rare change in the genetic code found in Queen Victoria's line, was present. It was the smoking gun of biology. The debate about whether the family had survived, the legends of escapes and hidden wagons, dissolved in the chemical solution. But there was a puzzle, a mystery within the mystery. The Tsar's DNA was harder to pin down. The Tsarina matched Prince Philip perfectly. The children matched the mother. But the Tsar had a strange quirk in his genetics, a condition called heteroplasmy. It is rare. In most people, the mitochondrial DNA is a uniform sequence. In Nicholas, there was a variation, a single-letter difference in some of his cells. It was a mutation that existed in him and his brother, but it was incredibly rare in the general population. The scientists at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab had to dig deeper. They needed to prove that the man with the shattered skull was the Tsar. They could not rely on a simple match. They had to find the needle in the haystack. They exhumed the body of Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke George. He had died of tuberculosis in 1899 and was buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. The scientists drilled into his bone. They found the same rare mutation, the same heteroplasmy. It was a biological fingerprint shared only by brothers. The evidence was irrefutable. The man in the mud was Nicholas II. The historical argument that science closed the chapter is not an exaggeration. It was a slammed door. For 70 years, the Soviets had obfuscated. They had hidden the bodies. They had destroyed the records. They had allowed the myth of Anastasia to fester because it suited their purpose of confusion. But the machines did not care about politics. They did not care about the Soviet narrative or the émigré fantasies. The DNA verdict on the first grave was clear. The Tsar, the Tsarina, 3 daughters, Dr. Botkin, the servants, all dead, all accounted for. But the grave was incomplete. The numbers were wrong. There were 5 family members in the grave. There should have been 7. The Tsarevich Alexei was missing. 1 daughter was missing. This fueled the last dying embers of hope. Maybe the boy had survived. Maybe the heir had been saved. The myth of the survivor shifted from Anastasia to Alexei. The missing bones became a sanctuary for denial. Then, in 2007, the second grave was found. Just a few meters away in the Poroshenkov log, a shallow pit. Burnt wood. Fragments. The scientists went back to work. The remains in the second grave were badly damaged. They had been burned with gasoline. They had been doused with sulfuric acid. They had been crushed. The bones were in pieces. A shard of a pelvis. A fragment of a cranium. A few teeth. It was a forensic nightmare. But the science had advanced. The ability to extract DNA from degraded samples has improved. They took the fragments to the lab. The results came back. The DNA from the second grave matched the DNA from the first grave. The fragments belonged to the children of the Tsar and Tsarina. 1 set of remains was male. He had the markers for hemophilia. The genetic mutation that caused the royal disease was found in the bone. It was Alexei, the heir. The boy whose illness had toppled the throne. The other set of remains was female. She was one of the daughters. The scientists could determine that she was older than the other 3 girls in the first grave. It was Maria, or perhaps Anastasia. The debate over which daughter was in which grave still flickers. But the essential fact remains. She was a Romanov. She was there. She was dead. The forensic reports detailed the cause of death. The boy had been shot. The girl had been shot. There was no evidence of survival. No evidence of escape. Just the brutal final trauma of high-velocity bullets shattering young bone. The scientific papers were published. The data was peer-reviewed. It was a cold, hard fact. The entire family had perished. The line was extinct. This transitioned the Romanovs from a mystery to a memory. Without the science, they were ghosts. They were characters in a tragic play where the final scene was missing. With the science, they became bodies, human remains, victims. The identification process allowed the state to act. In 1998, 80 years after the murder, the remains from the first grave were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. It was a state funeral. The president, Boris Yeltsin, attended. He stood by the coffins. The coffins were simple. White. The bells of the cathedral rang out. A deep, mournful toll that shook the dust from the rafters. The Tsar was coming home. The ceremony was heavy with the weight of history. The politicians gave speeches about reconciliation, about closing the wounds of the Civil War, but the science had done the real work. Science had made the funeral possible. Without the DNA, the bones could have been anyone's. They could have been props in a political theater. The DNA gave them back their names. The argument that science allowed history to move to memorialization is seen in the quiet of the cathedral. The tombs are there now. White marble sarcophagi. Names carved in gold. Nicholas Alexandrovich, Alexandra Fyodorovna, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and later, in 2021, the remains from the second grave were interred. The family was whole again. The boy who was never crowned was laid to rest with his sisters. The laboratories are quiet now. The tests are done. The files are archived. The genetic codes are stored in databases, a digital echo of a bloodline that once ruled 1/6 of the Earth's surface. There is a strange poetry in it. The Tsar believed in the divine right of kings. He believed in the mystery of power. He was brought down by the materialist logic of the Bolsheviks, and in the end, his identity was restored by the materialist logic of science. The microscope replaced the icon. The mystery of the phantom Anastasia was laid to rest. The rumors of hidden heirs were silenced. The DNA did not care about the longing of the monarchists or the cynicism of the Soviets. It just told the truth, a truth written in the very cells of the bone. The forest where they were found is still there. The birch trees still sway in the wind. The mud still gets soft in the spring, but the hole in the ground is empty. The physical link to the past has been severed and moved to a stone cathedral in a city built by a man named Peter. The story of the Romanovs ended in a basement. It ended in a truck. It ended in a fire. But the history ended in a lab, a quiet room with white walls and the hum of a machine, where a single line on a computer screen finally said, "Match."